Welcome to everyone. On behalf of the Provo City Municipal Council, I'm delighted to extend a cordial welcome. The meeting is recorded and will be posted to the Provo City website. I remind those seated at the table that microphones mounted here are sort to pick up noise, paper, as well as side conversations. Brian Jones is out of town today, and we welcome Steve Schreiner, Chief Prosecutor from the City Attorney's Office, who is our legal advisor for the work meeting and the council meeting later today. I invite Ms. Jorgensen to be first in the roll call.
Louise Jorgensen.
Steve Schreiner. Matt Taylor.
Hal Miller.
Gary Winterton. Kay Van Buren.
Stephen Hales.
Kim Santiago.
Dave Sewell. Wayne Parker.
Thank you. We note that Mr. Garrett is excused. May soon join us. We're delighted to welcome Carla Zollinger, the Library Services Manager, to offer our invocation and to briefly report on her role at the library.
Our Father in heaven, we thank thee for the opportunity we have to gather today to work toward the well-being of those in our community. We're grateful for the opportunity that we have to do that, and for the great blessing we have to live in this part of the world, and for the safety that we enjoy. We're grateful for the many blessings which we have. We say these things in Jesus Christ.
Amen.
So I'm Carla Zollinger. I'm the Adult and Teen Services Manager at the Provo City Library. I have a staff of 13 librarians. We man the reference desks and make sure that we have the books, services, and programs that the community requires. We spend a lot of our time telling people about new things, particularly downloadable stuff, which is kind of new now. So we have downloadable books and audiobooks and magazines and all that kind of stuff. And so always telling everyone about all the exciting things at the library. I don't know how much detail I'm supposed to go into, but that's what I do. And they said to also say what I love about working for Provo. I just hit my 15-year mark, so the vacation's awesome. But what I really like is just the support that I get on all different levels in my job. The community is a great support for the library. We feel lots of love. Government managers and that we feel a lot of support in the things that we're doing on that level. And I particularly really appreciate our director, Gene Nelson, who supported me in the things that I've been able to do over the past 15 years working for Provo.
Questions, Ms. Zollinger, or comments?
Classes on downloadable books. Do you do that, or do you just come down and get help for that?
You can come down anytime and just get help, though we do have some open lab time. We call it open lab with a librarian that we specifically invite people to come. It's on Tuesdays between 3:30 and 5, and on Thursday evenings between 7 and 9. And in our computer lab, we have a librarian there for those hours, someone that speaks Spanish and someone that speaks English, to just walk people through whatever they need, give them help with downloadable things or any other kind of computer things that they need assistance with. So yeah, but anytime you want to come down, we walk people through the process all the time. Bring your device with you. It's a lot easier to show people how to do it than tell people how to do it.
Okay.
But it's pretty easy.
Once you get registered online, it's there's an app on every device. It's very simple to do. It's a little bit complicated to get on, but once you're on and registered, it's very simple thereafter.
And the same thing for magazines. We just barely started one, a service called Zinio, that you can download magazines right to your devices and get them monthly, all the updates and new editions and things like that. So it takes just a little bit to get it all set up, but once it's set up, it's really awesome. Yeah.
I've heard you're doing some really creative things there. A couple of my girls went to some kind of a murder mystery thing the other night, and I've heard about some kind of Minecraft Friday night thing that you've got going.
Yeah, we actually have 3 different Minecraft clubs going on right now for kids. We have some from 8 to 12, and then some for the teenagers 12 to 18. They've been really popular. It's been really fun. And then we did a lock-in at the library, let teens come in. If they started at 7, then the library shut down at 9, and teens got to stay until 11. And my librarians put together, one of them died and was dressed up like a zombie. And they were trying to figure out what librarian killed her for taking their books on hold. It was pretty gruesome. But we had 150 teens come, so it was really exciting. It was a really, really successful program, and we're hoping we can keep those teens coming in to the library.
I just had a question. So the library, does it have electronic readers like Kindles that are checked out to people?
We don't. About 13 years ago, we started trying to do that. Right now, it's really hard with the way Amazon and other distributors have their accounts. It's really hard to be able to let people load what they want onto devices that are owned by the library. And there have been some libraries that have figured it out, but we couldn't figure out the logistics on how exactly it would work for the community. Having them available when people needed them would require, anyways, it was just kind of a little bit harder. So we decided to just put our money into supplying the actual content, and hopefully they can use it on computers of any kind as well as mobile devices. So there's lots of different ways you can access it.
So they can bring their own device in and get a book.
Yeah,
And on
yeah.
the magazines, are those, like, do they check them out, or once they have a magazine, they have it forever?
Yeah, once you have it, you have it. And so you can download it to your device, and you want to clean it off every once in a while, but it maintains an archive of the things that we've purchased. So we've just had it for a year, so our archive doesn't go back very far, but as we go forward with the service, they'll be able to access all of the past issues as well. And it's not like the ebooks where you check it out for 3 weeks and then it needs to go back and only one person can have it at a time. The magazines, it's just everybody free for all, you get it, and anyone can check them out.
How many magazines do you subscribe to?
We have about between 60 and 70, hoping to get a few more. And a lot of them, we're a little bit limited on who's actually working with the service that we're getting them through, and we'll let them buy it. But we're hoping to pick up a few more titles and make as many popular titles available as possible. But there's some really good ones on there.
And this all comes with a library card.
All with your library card, yes. Yeah. So I hope y'all have one.
Well, if you don't mind my saying, it's not difficult to tell why exciting things are happening under your watch. We appreciate your liveliness and your commitment.
Well, thank you.
Congratulate you on the extended vacation.
Right, I know. I'm going to take it. I'm going to use it.
Thank you. Now to Ryan Harvey for a discussion of the proposed fiscal year 2014-2015 Municipal Council legislative intent statements.
Yeah, so if you just take one and pass it down. So, I sent an email about a couple hours ago informing you that we put together the preliminary draft, sent it out with the agenda on Friday, and then I received a few emails back with some changes, so I incorporated those. Those are here. They're also, if you update SIRE, we republished the agenda, so they're also part of the SIRE materials as well. I'm going to go through these very briefly. The first 6 are actually ones that we talked about at last Tuesday's budget meeting. So those are here. I'll go through those real quickly, and then 7, 8, and 9 are actually ones the next day that the budget committee recommended that you add as well. And so as of right now, this is Exhibit D as part of the budget resolution that you're set to pass tonight. So if you have any changes, we'd like to know now so we can have that ready for tonight's meeting. So I'll just go through it real quickly. Number 1 talks about separating the rec center from the rest of Parks and Recreation in the budget book. Number 2 talks about having that separation incorporated in the quarterly report so you can see how the rec center is doing each quarter. Number 3 talks about what we talked about for most of the time, or for the second half of the time last Tuesday, about finding a dedicated funding source for CIP needs and continuing to look for that Number 4 just talks about adjusting the report, the CIP report. Number 5 talks about to continue to be creative, giving the directive to be creative and looking for alternative ways of increasing revenue, including the sales tax base. Number 6 is a intent statement that comes directly from the intent statements from before of develop a long-term sustainable budget. So the ongoing goal there. And then, as I said, 7, 8, and 9 come from the budget committee. 7 talks about going forward with the impact fee study and hiring a consultant to do that. Number 8 talks about user fees and an approach going forward on user fees and having each department in the city look at their user fees and adjust those accordingly. And then number 9 was, after we look at the impact and the user fees, looking into the RAP tax. So those are the 9 intent statements that we have that you've talked about and the budget committee's talked about. So I turn it over to you to, if there's any comments, any changes to any of these, then we can go.
Thank you, Mr. Harvey. Are there such?
Just one other question on 9. When appropriate, is there any kind of, what's the determining factor on what is when appropriate?
Yeah, originally, if you remember, when I sent it out on Friday, it said after looking at user fees and impact fees. The reason that we changed that is because there was a concern that the process of looking at impact fees and user fees could take 18 months to 2 years. It could be a very long process, and that maybe the RAP tax you might want to look on that for next year's ballot. And so we were that's why we took out when those are finished. But we
But
could
we might
change that.
reasonably interpret it as annually to consider until such time as it might be adopted.
But that was the idea, was to look at user fees and impact fees before considering a RAP tax. It was to look at the users. And so I think the previous language was probably more specific to what our plans were. If it takes 2 years, then I guess it takes 2 years to find out how we can, what we can get from the fees before we then can consider a RAP tax. That was the original.
That was kind of
the original.
feel I had from the original
Right.
intent statement.
Right.
Yeah, and the budget committee, that was their recommendation.
And then at the time also, I think it was to look at the RAP tax and see how it was to be used, whether it's reduced subsidies
Yeah.
or to, that we could then throw into the general fund. It all will go into the discussion on RAP tax and see where we need to, because this is not necessarily saying it will all go to recreation and
Yeah.
parks and things like that. It just depends on where we as a council decide at the time we really look at it.
Other comments?
So if that's, would you like it to be changed back to the original language then, of after user fees and impact fees are complete? I guess that's
So
Question.
one appropriate comment following completion of 7 and 8,
right.
something like that.
Is that what you would? Okay, we'll put that back in there.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
And we know that Mr. Garrett has joined us.
And I have one more question on number 5, where it talks about identifying creative alternatives of additional revenue, including the increasing the sales tax base. That's really administrative duty to look for increased sales tax. I don't know if we need to put that in there, add that in there, that that's sort of a
Does
request of
the
administration.
preface cover that?
Work with the mayor.
To work with the mayor, oh, okay, yeah, I guess.
And also, just to be clear, we're not necessarily thinking increasing the sales tax, but you mean just the retail.
The retail
in the
sales
city.
revenue, I guess is what that's the revenue, not the tax.
Including that as a possibility among others. Thank you.
Sales tax revenue base, revenue base.
So that's revenue based, we
So
have the
that
word revenue in
base
there?
doesn't-
Yeah.
Add revenue in there.
Yeah,
add revenue.
Recently, we received a report on the enforcement of zoning in the city. It was a monthly report, and there were questions about how properly to interpret it. We are delighted that Carrie Walls, the zoning administrator, can join us to further describe the report and respond to questions.
I'm gonna fix the mic real quick, Gary.
I'm probably not going to use it because I don't usually need it. You're going to take one of those and pass it around. This is the typical report you would get from our case file system, which is the database that we use to keep track of our cases. Not only does it serve zoning enforcement, it serves planning, it serves building, it serves all of our functions in community development. If you look at this, and I forgot to keep one for myself, but that's okay, I have it memorized. Thanks, Wayne. So on here, you'll see that first little section. First is all the neighborhoods, and there's some typical little items that need to be changed on this, but for the most part, this first section just talks about the neighborhood, and then it has complaints regarding occupancy, which are number of people that live in the property, in a property, where perhaps they're over-occupied or something along that line. That's the first little group of items. So it talks about complaints that were received in each neighborhood, any that were unfounded, ones that are in process, and ones where a notice of violation has been sent to ask the property owner to come into compliance. The next section says all other complaints. All other complaints can be landscaping, junk, weeds, that they don't have a necessary, either a rental dwelling license or a business license or a building permit, or health and safety items, that type of thing. And it's broken down the same way, received, unfounded, in process, and notice of violation sent. And then that last little column is RDL, means rental dwelling license. Those are cases that we receive that are people applying for a rental license. They own rental property, they're applying for the license as is required by the code, and that's what shows up there. At the bottom, you'll see the months of the year, and then cases open, cases received, and cases open at month end. Now, the cases open at month end, I'm not even sure how accurate that is, only because of the fact that I know that we have more cases than what is listed here that are open. But the cases opened, it's usually a total of the total number of occupancy complaints received and all other complaints received. That's that first number, cases open. And then cases resolved, which would be cases closed. Now, a case doesn't always get resolved the same month that it's opened. Sometimes they are open for years. Occupancy is one of the hardest things that we do, that we have to enforce on. It's very difficult to enforce on and quite a challenge for us. Now, I just recently took this position just about a month ago, a little over a month ago. And when I got this, and I've seen it before when I worked under Rita, but I thought, I wonder how accurate this is. And so I did a spreadsheet that would allow me to break down where exactly the complaints were, as far as specifically what was being complained about in each neighborhood. I've heard some talk about, we want to, certainly we want to be sensitive to the neighborhoods and what they're looking at, what needs enforcement in their neighborhood. What may be important in one neighborhood may not be important in another neighborhood. So I wanted to see what that breakdown was. So the two items that are in the blocks, the dark outlined sections, those are two that are on this form, the smaller form, are totaled up separately, and that's why they're like that, just for my purposes. So this number, the June or the May, where it says 55 on this one, that corresponds with the total on here that says total without RDL, without rental dwelling license. Does that make sense? So you can see across the board here what kind of complaints we're getting in the neighborhoods. Okay, And so my whole goal here today, and I'm really happy to speak with all of you and get some input, is I want to know, do the items on these reports reflect what you're looking for, what you want to know? Do you have some suggestions as far as what should be on those reports, what you think would be more telling as far as how things are going for the city, how well we are doing on enforcement, whether or not we're enforcing the appropriate items, or whether or not we're resolving things in a timely manner? Of course, a lot of that has to deal with how cooperative our clientele is. So,
I guess I have a question.
mhm.
Is it most of the work, it sounds like, is based on some kind of a complaint? So you're not really doing anything until a complaint comes in?
The majority of our work is complaint-based, yes. But one of the instructions that we've always been given, and probably as far back as when Matt was a code enforcement officer, is when you're out at a property on a complaint and you look around, if you see another property that has some issues, certainly you want to write down that address and enforce on them equally. So most of it is complaint-driven, but we do look around and see what else is going on and try to address those items as well.
Harry, if I could add though, that can balloon really fast depending on what street you're on. So.
Oh, come on, Matt.
Well, and that just becomes it's just a reality you got to deal with as far as how much resources you have. And even in my experience, when you take on some of those additional proactive cases, and then it comes back to, why are you picking on me? Why is the city dumping on me when there was no complaint? So you get the opposite reaction sometimes. Hey, you normally aren't proactive, but in this case, you chose to be proactive. Why did you do that? So you can.
That could be a problem too. Is it feasible? Do you have the bandwidth to decide we're going to go into a neighborhood and maybe look at junk, weeds, and landscaping generally? Because I know a lot of the downtown neighborhoods have real problems with that.
We don't right now. We don't have the resources to do that. I have 4 zoning officers. 2 of them have only been with me a month.
So
they're awesome, but they're not that awesome.
Sure. I'm just wondering, what do you think would be the best way to do something like that if we wanted to really focus on maybe one particular neighborhood in a month or in a period of time?
That is actually something I'm looking at and thinking about. The mayor has asked me to look at best practices, and look at doing that. I'm looking at other cities and how they're handling things, what works, what doesn't work. I know what works and what doesn't work here. And sometimes it seems like one thing will work for a while and then it changes. When I first started doing this, we did just the administrative enforcement where we would fine people. Then the problem was how to collect those fines. And then we decided to go with the Justice Court. And Justice Court has been really helpful, but again, it seems to not be a long-term solution.
Do you think there would be some way to get neighborhood chairs involved? Like, what if the neighborhood chairs were actually doing the observation and recommendation, or making actual complaints in your neighborhood about that?
Right now, I have some neighborhood chairs that already do that. That their neighbors go to them with their complaints. They will call up or they'll email or whatever, and they'll say, this is what's going on here. And they keep tabs on that. I have other neighborhoods chairs that I've never heard from. It just depends on the area.
Would you recommend that we have some kind of guidelines or instructions to the neighborhood chair, since the council's in charge of that, about how to do that and what's the best practice?
Well, and that's what I'm looking at right now, is looking at best practices and how other cities are doing it, and if it's working. Obviously we want to have a solution to the problems that is going to be efficient, and it's going to be equitable, and that it's going to hopefully address the problems that we have and keep new problems from cropping up. Kim, you had a question?
Yeah, I just wondered what constitutes a complaint. Does it have to be a formal thing that's written down or a form filled out? Because I see that there's only one here on a neighborhood that we've been working on specifically with Gary McGinn, and there were several several complaints in the neighborhood, but there's only one listed on
Mhm.
this form. It's the Wasatch.
Is that Wasatch?
Yeah.
That's only one occupancy complaint and only 2 other complaints
Oh,
For the month
okay.
of May.
for the month of
For the
May.
month of May.
Right, this is
Okay.
just for the month of May.
Okay.
Complaints come in all different manners. People will come into the office and complain in person.
Okay.
They will call us. They will use our website to
They can use
do
any
that.
form and
They
it'll
can-
get
they can call
recorded as
311.
as an official complaint.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and when those come into us, then they go to our secretary, who then makes a file, determines whose area, which zoning officer's area that is, and assigns that file to them. It is then the zoning officer's responsibility to go out and investigate that claim, and taking into consideration if the neighbor has, let's say it's an occupancy complaint. For instance, we had an occupancy complaint just a couple of weeks ago, and the neighbor said the owner of the property instructs his tenants to tell you there are only 3 people there. So my guys went out, and sure enough, the person that they spoke with at the door said, no, there are only 3 people living here. And we knew that that probably was not true because of the complaint that had come in. And so I instructed the zoning officer to take a police officer with them. And we're fortunate we have COP, and they're really great to work with. They went out with my zoning officer. They knocked on the door. The police officer questioned the person at the door, and then was told, no, there are 4. And we got 4 names. We got the information that we needed to get from them in order to enforce appropriately. Now what that does is that lets us know that, okay, property owner or tenant, somebody here is not being truthful. We keep track of that, and if you start to see a pattern of the same owner doing that same type of thing, those type of people, we don't waste our time, or I shouldn't say it that way, that doesn't sound very nice. We feel it's more effective to send them straight to legal department and have them go through that process rather than having a notice of violation, because a notice of violation is really just a courtesy. We're not even required to send one, but we do as a courtesy. Yes.
And so let me understand the complaints. The complaints that you receive, are they on a property and you count that as 1? Or if you get 10 complaints on the same property, is it counted as 10?
It's counted as 10.
It's counted as
Right.
10.
We may not have 10 separate files opened up. We sometimes get properties that we'll get one complaint on, we'll open up a file, another complaint will come in, we'll just piggyback that on. So that what will happen is in the memo section of our file, our case file, it'll say, received another complaint for such and such on this property. Okay.
And the only recourse you've got to get would be an owner of the property. Is that
Not
correct?
necessarily. It depends on what the complaint is. We have done things where we have enforced on the tenant, if it's the tenant's junk or junk car or whatever, or sometimes
You can enforce on a tenant.
we can enforce on a
Okay.
tenant. We can enforce on a management company. If it's the management company that's the responsible party to take care of certain things, we can enforce on them.
And let me ask one more question about permitted use complaints. We have one in our area that we're working with, and it's a challenge through I work with Gary, and Steve, maybe you can help us with this a little bit, help me a little bit here. We talk about getting, it's a civil complaint, I guess, that if they're going against non-permitted use. Is that right? Can we get injunctions? I guess that's the bottom line, the question that I'm asking, to stop the activity while it's being sent to trial, because we still have an issue with the same thing going on. And yet we did have a court date in which the person didn't show up, and now we have a trial date set. And yet the activity is still going on. What is that's frustrating? And they said, well, we have to be patient for the legal process to play out.
Right, and there's due process that everybody's entitled to.
Right.
And Gary, for the most part, is in the criminal justice system because he's filing criminal charges against somebody. So yeah, there are steps that need to be followed. And the question, we've gone through over the years, should we go after people civilly? Should we go after people criminally? it's hard to tell what's going to be most effective and which is going to be effective quickest. And so
an injunction or a cease and desist order or whatever you could do legally, are they hard to come by without going through the process? Criminal.
a lot of times, because if you're talking an injunction, you're thinking about safety and those types of things, and we're not necessarily concerned about safety with over occupancy.
But if it's a non-permitted, this one that I'm thinking about is not a occupancy issue. It is a use.
Large trucks in the neighborhood. And
Yeah,
that could be
large
considered a
trucks
safety.
and parking issues
It's
and
the big.
deliveries and.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the case you're talking about. I could talk to Gary about it.
Gary knows about it and is dealing with it. And I think we have a criminal date set on the 12th. July. And we had it at the end of May, but I guess they didn't show up for the thing. They asked for time, and the judge said, we're just going to set the date. So should I just be talking with Gary on that, following through with that, or how?
I would imagine he could keep you apprised of what's happening in the process.
I
Yes.
have a couple of questions. Is it illegal to lie to one of your officers?
Actually, it is.
Okay,
We have
so
a
that's
section in our
important.
ordinance that says that to refuse to give information or to give incorrect information is a misdemeanor.
Do we prosecute for that? Have we ever?
We have on occasion enforced where we've brought all of the tenants into justice court. We've done that, and it's effective for that particular instance. You know, but not for a long term. Yeah.
You mentioned that the justice court wasn't a long-term solution. I was just curious about that. Why is that?
Well, it just doesn't seem like it's being as effective as it was at the beginning, to me.
What's happening that you're seeing?
Well, I know that we've had a drop in cases, so certainly having a justice court for zoning enforcement, you know, people will laugh about zoning because it's not as important as drug things or DUIs or any of that, but it is important for a neighborhood, certainly. But so our justice court right now has a zoning case day every other month. Every other month. And so you're talking about when we send somebody over to legal department, they have their process that they have to go through. And by the time someone gets served a subpoena to appear in court, it might take a few weeks. Then if your court date isn't for another 2 months, that's kind of, it's not that serious. You know? That's my interpretation of it. And so I was really very glad when the mayor asked that I look at best practices and that been talking with Gary McGinn about, you know, how to get the resolution we want on the cases as quickly as we can, because certainly that's important to the people that are complaining about the issues. It's important to us, and it may not be as important to the people we're enforcing on, but they need to understand that they have rights, but so do their neighbors have rights. And we all want to live together, and unfortunately, we have to have laws to be able to do that.
Forgive me if this seems simple-minded. Is this a problem?
What, doing this?
No.
Or,
Is what is reported here a problem?
well, zoning kind of goes in cycles, and a lot of that has to do with you. If the council in power isn't that interested in zoning or doesn't feel that zoning is that important, then our caseload goes down. It kind of is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more we get cases, the more we get complaints, it seems like the more we get complaints. So the more we enforce, the more people will complain. The more it's not as important or focused on, then it kind of drops. So, for instance, when I was a zoning officer, which was only 4.5 years ago, I had over 200 cases, just me. And pretty much every one of the other zoning officers also had about the same. Right now I have 2 new guys who have only been doing this for about a month, and they probably have about 50 to 80 cases each. And a lot of that is cases that are left over from people that have left. The other 2 guys that have been here longer, one of them has about 120, and the other has about 90. So as we start focusing more, then we'll start getting more cases, and then you'll start to see, because people start to realize, oh, the city's starting to take notice again, so we're going to call and complain about this or that and the other. In fact, I can't believe how many calls I get every day from people that are calling to complain about issues. Sometimes there are issues and sometimes they're not our issues. But our goal is to do the best that we absolutely can, being fair and equitable, and to get some resolution. So my question for you is, does this report satisfy what you want to see? What do you want to see when we talk about zoning?
It's not zoning, it's zoning enforcement.
True.
I think more than just, speaking personally, more than just the number of incidents and what kind they are, I, like you, would like to know what is happening, what led to them, what were the problems, and how quickly are they resolved, what's being done.
Okay.
When you had 200 cases, was that just overwhelming or was that doable?
Well, the 200 cases were kind of split between zoning enforcement and rental dwelling licenses. And so this was back in the day when rental licensing was fairly new. We had just a ton of things to do, and we used to do inspections as well. And then the state changed that, so we don't do inspections all the time anymore. But as far as it was stressful to have that many cases be under your purview. But a lot of times you'll give somebody a deadline, and then they'll have this waiting period. So you'll have a bunch that'll be in waiting, and then you'll have some that you'll be working on. And we also, as a team, we would always, if somebody needed help, we could say, hey, can you take maybe a couple of my cases, and that type of thing. We all worked as a team, and that's the way we are now as well. With 2 new guys training, the guys that have been here for a while, they take them out. They show them the ropes. I take them out. We go and we knock on doors, and there's a delicate way to talk to people to try to get them to give you the information that you need, and yet still show them that you have questions and that you have the authority to enforce on them if you need to. And so that's part of the training as well. But yeah, sometimes it does feel kind of heavy when you have 200 cases, but it's just part of the job.
One thing that, you want to add to that? One thing that I'd like to see that might be harder to quantify is the trickle-down effects from taking care of, say, one occupancy issue, and how does that affect those in the neighborhood? How has it gone down? Has it had any effect at all? It'd be nice to know how that, the neighborhoods that I drive through, I can see it's visible. You can see when sort of things have come in line with some of the homes, and they have someone taking care of the place, and they have the right occupancy even matters in some of these homes. And so sometimes it's visible, but it'd be nice to see as well, like how the occupancy problems went down. If you had so many complaints and you took care of one in a strategic area, did that also take care of
people take
3 or a couple around that area? It'd be nice to know what the trickle down effects are, so that then you could strategically do this throughout the city. You could maybe pick places in each neighborhood and sort of rotate, so that they don't know that it's always just going to be a complaint, but there's sort of a system to what you're doing, and that at any time or place they could be possibly caught. I don't know how else to say that, but so that there's sort of a systematic way of reaching places rather than just responding to the complaints. But I know that some of the people that that don't complain because they don't want to complain about their neighbor, and they don't want to complain about a ward member or whoever, you know, that they know has, you know, too many people in their home. And so it would be nice if the city actually, you know, if we were able to
See,
randomly
right.
pick, you know, places that we knew that we felt like we knew were out of compliance. But is that too hard to find out what they are without having neighbors tell you?
Well, it is difficult. Like I said, occupancy is the hardest thing to enforce.
Yeah, and I think that's the most that we get the most complaints about
We do.
occupancy.
And some places do not even enforce on the occupancy because it is so hard to prove. If somebody says, oh, we're all family, we have no way to say to them, prove it. You know, we can't. So we have to take their word for it. The same as when someone tells us at the door, no, there are only 3 people here. The only proof we have is if a neighbor calls up and says, no, I know that there are this many people there. I would like to see the trickle-down effect too, and if it affects other people. My concern is that you would think that neighbors would want to put at least a little bit of pressure on the neighbor that's not in compliance to try to get them into compliance, but perhaps that person that's not in compliance doesn't really care. You know, especially if it's a rental property, they don't live there. They're not affected by it. I talk to people just about every day that want to purchase property here in town because they have a son or a daughter that are attending BYU or UVU or whatever, and they want their son or daughter to live in the home, and they want to be able to have all their friends live with them too. And then they want to have the next son or daughter move in there and the same thing happen. And the neighborhood is affected in a negative manner many times. And it's just, and people want us to tell them how to get around the law. You know, when especially in the Tree Streets, Wasatch neighborhood, they want to be able to buy a home that they can have an accessory apartment in. They're the ones buying the home, but they want the daughter or the son to be the owner so they can take advantage of the accessory apartment. It's just really difficult that people, and they don't understand why we are so against it. And I try to tell them, think about it, would you want that living next to you? Well, sure I would. Fine. Buy the house next door and live next door to your son or daughter and all their friends. And it's hard not to feel like you just want to shake them, you know, and to be kind to them still and to try to make them understand that they really don't understand. And I think a lot of what we're going to end up having to do is we're going to have to do some sort of educational type of information that is going to let people know, you know, this is what's expected. I live in Spanish Fork. Recently in my utility bill, there was a blurb about keeping your lawn neat and mowed. Now, probably not everybody reads it, but I bet a lot of people do read it. And it said, city will enforce if it's over 6 inches high, which made me promptly go out and mow my lawn because it was higher than 6 inches. But something as simple as that, you know, to let people know, oh, by the way, did you know that if you have stuff stored outside or couches on your porch, you can be enforced on. And this is what can happen. I think that's an important part of this.
Are all complaints have to be, can they be anonymous?
Yes. Yep.
And so I think that's one of the things that.
But even if they're not anonymous, that is protected information and it is not given out to anybody. Even if somebody comes in and requests with a grandma request, they want a copy of the complaint. We'll give them a copy of the complaint, but we make a copy, we black out both sides, make another copy so that you can't read through it if it's a handwritten one. Obviously, if it's a printed one, we just delete the section that has someone's name on it if it has a name. But that is protected information and we do not give that out to anybody. Now, some people that have been complained on are pretty good guessers about who complains. And they will use that and say, I know it was you, the city told me. And we've been told by that person who actually complained, well, they told me, you told them. No, we don't do that. So if somebody says, I want to be anonymous, we're fine with that. If somebody says, I want to know, I want to get some feedback about what's happening, they can rest assured that we're not going to provide their information to anybody.
I'm excited to hear what the best practices are when you learn that, because I think you'll learn a lot of things. But I'm just wondering if there isn't some way for the neighborhood organization to be the beginning level of this process, where a neighborhood chair goes around and puts something on every door where there's an upholstered couch on the porch saying, you're in violation of city code, unless this is removed, we will make a formal complaint. So it doesn't actually rise to the level of complaint, but at least they're put on notice that they're doing something wrong, and if they don't correct it at that level, then it will become a complaint.
Well, I do have some neighborhood chairs that are very proactive that way. That they will go, maybe not put something on their door, but they'll talk to them and say, hey, I know this ABCD is happening and that's against the city's rules. You need to stop, or I'm going to file a formal complaint. And sometimes it's very effective. Sometimes that neighborhood chair will come and file a formal complaint.
And I think what happens too is there's a lot of things that go into the personality of the neighborhood chair,
Mm-hmm.
the attitude they go, and is it a friendly thing where we're trying to be a neighborhood together, or am I the enforcer? I mean, so there's
Right.
lots of different. The ideal is, the chair can kind of start that, and as a neighborhood, they clean themselves up, and it doesn't take.
Right, and then I'll be out of a job.
We have a neighborhood chair too, though, that also sends out his monthly newsletter reminders of this is what we've decided our neighborhood, we
Right.
want our neighborhood to look like, and just a reminder that, these are the uses, these are the conforming uses, and he just a friendly reminder that this is what's acceptable in the neighborhood, rather than you're out of compliance, I'm gonna get you in
Right.
trouble. It's more
It's
just a
again
reminder,
the finesse of
a reminder of this
talking
is
to
what
people.
this is what
Right.
we've decided as a neighborhood, and this is what the general plan says, or this is what and he's very good at sort of, like you say, finessing that without coming across as being sort of the heavy hand.
Right, the enforcer.
The
Maybe
enforcer.
that falls back on our responsibility a little bit in our training of our neighborhood chairs. The trainings you have, somehow maybe we could take this item, and some of them that are really good at it, you can come and give a demonstration,
Mhm.
do a role playing and say.
And the neighborhood is really well,
And we
I mean,
have
they're
great neighborhoods. I mean, I don't know how many of you attended the historic home tour on Thursday and Friday. It was so fun to go and walk through these homes and talk to the property owners and see them talking with their neighbors and just enjoying that. Mazerhead neighborhood is a fabulous neighborhood, and Tree Streets is a fabulous neighborhood. They're all great. They all have such positive things about them and such potential, many of them. And if we can get neighborhoods to be banded together and to be more cohesive and police themselves, sure, my job will be so much easier. In fact, I'll probably be unemployed, but I've heard that we can always get a job at the rec center, so. Did you have any other questions, Hal?
I do. This is a vexing issue of long standing.
Yes.
And all we can do is praise you for accepting an impossible job. And at the same time, to say that our fondest hope would be to put you out of a job because there is no longer a need for the kind of enforcement you're saddled with. It seems to me that you occupy a level of status within the public perception that's well below that of the police.
Mm-hmm.
And consequently, there is this kind of very relaxed notion on the part of property owners and occupants of property about what they can get away with, even if you should show up. It's a bit like animal control in that way. And I don't know that the city can or should afford a more police-like presence with this kind of enforcement. It strikes me that the notion of trusting neighborhoods to police themselves is a worthy one, and one that we should be working toward. But I would ask you, in the course of your examination of best practices and your conclusions about which of them are the best fit to Provo, that you would at the same time, with the help of others in the administration, identify the current ordinances that could be changed, that need to be changed in order to coincide and to provide synergy with those best practices. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, we would appreciate your expertise being directed toward a set of recommendations for changes in legislation that would make it easy for you to follow through with best practices, and see that as a kind of stepping stone toward what we ultimately trust will become the business of neighborhoods and no one else's.
That would be great. I hope we get to that point. You know, the one thing that really makes me sad, I've worked for Provo City for 9.5 years. The first 4.5 years I worked as the code enforcement officer, then 4 years as a planner. And to come back into zoning and find that the people that are still violating are people that were violating 9.5 years ago. And I think that one of the things that we're going to have to look at with best practices is going to have to be a more sterner way to enforce on them and make it to where it's not feasible for them to violate. So I'm hoping that in the course of looking at best practices and looking at our ordinances, we can find some way to have people realize that it's not worth it to me to violate in Provo City because it's going to cost me one way or another. And I don't think there should be the same level for someone who owns their home and lives in their home as for people that own multiple properties and these are just investments for them. I think there should be a hierarchy there. And certainly there should be a hierarchy for people that offend the first time versus someone who is a multiple offender and who has been a continual problem. So I hope that that's what's going to come from this best practices. I hope that when we talk about these reports every month, or you talk about them amongst yourself, that if you feel like you have a suggestion or something that you think you'd like to see on there, just feel free to email me. I'd be happy to hear your comments.
You asked for feedback on the report. I think this is the first one I've seen in the 5 months I've been here. So to me, that's a big step forward, and I feel more in the loop. I appreciate it.
And if you have questions about it, like I said, just feel free to drop me an email, give me a call, whatever. Okay.
Could you provide us with the spreadsheet as a report to the council, perhaps through our executive director? Just add this row to so as to be year to date.
Okay.
Unresolved.
To date, year to date and unresolved, or year to date?
Year to date unresolved.
Okay.
So we get to see those that are new in the month, and then a sense of the backlog.
Well, that will make me very embarrassed, but I will do
No.
it. There are some cases that have
Please,
been
no
open since
embarrassment.
2003.
Please, no embarrassment.
Do you have any other questions for
Yeah,
me?
as you bring that up, Carrie, why are they open till 2003? Why are we having to drag that on so long?
A lot of them are not zoning enforcement cases. A lot of them are the rental dwelling licensing cases. For one reason or another, for instance, if you know Southwood Manor, you know that down on 500 South and 900 West. A bunch of owners own that individual buildings within that project. And we have been trying very desperately for several years now to work with them as a group, get them to become a cohesive group and maybe do a homeowners association to work together to improve that project as a whole. And it's a series of a bunch of buildings with different number of, well, I don't even know how many apartments. I think there's like 8 apartments in each unit or something like that, or maybe 4.
Just north of the boulders.
Yeah, and it's pretty bad.
So are they not being cooperative in doing it, or is it just?
They would come to meeting and they would talk the talk, but when it came down to it, they don't have the funding, they don't have this, they don't want to put forth the money to do it. So.
Is that to bring it up to code?
Just to bring it and make it livable. The,
make
if
it
you drive
livable,
through,
to do
if
the
you drive
inspection.
through the parking lot, you might lose your car.
I drove through there a couple days ago and I didn't lose my car, but I wouldn't have drove through it. I wouldn't have gone there at night. I'll say that.
No,
It was during the day.
no.
So yeah, it's pretty bad.
Yeah, so I recently made the decision, you know, we're done. We do try to work with people. We don't want to be so arbitrary that we say, this is your deadline, that's it, we're not talking to you anymore, you're off to legal on everything. There are some things it's appropriate, but there are some things you want to try to work things out, because the whole goal is to get compliance, not to take them to court. And if you think you can work it out with them, it's far better. Sometimes things like that do take a long time, but there comes a certain point where you just have to say, it's not, they're not even trying, so we'll let the judge deal with them. That makes me sad, because I think, you know, to me, and I don't own any property other than the house that I live in, but to me, if you are fortunate enough to be able to own property and have those investments, and you have people that are relying on you for a place to live, at least you could do is provide them with something that's livable and decent. And that's the whole goal. One of the whole goals of our division is to make sure that homes are health. They're someplace that someone can live that's healthy and it's safe. You know, the standards aren't very high. They're minimum standards, for goodness sakes. And it's just sad to me when I go into some units and I look at the way they are, and I think, and people are actually paying $600 and $700 a month to live like this. That makes me sad.
I wish there was something that Gary mentioned, an injunction, where we could just say, you know, we're through. This is closed. No one may live here until this is resolved in the courts. But we don't have a system like that, it sounds like.
We don't.
Yeah.
We don't. And, you know, like I
Nor are
said,
we likely to get one.
when we started
Because
with
it's
the rental,
unconstitutional.
when we started with the rental dwelling licensing program, if a property was wanting to be licensed as something other than what it was built, for instance, a home that had been converted into a duplex or a triplex or whatever, we would do a health and safety inspection. The state took that away, mainly because of a particular property owner who's also in the legislation, you know, and so that makes me sad, you know, that
But
that's
it's still
allowed to
gone. I
happen.
know that they tried to repair that a little bit, but that,
The only time we go out and we do inspections is if we have a complaint about specifically health and safety. But if somebody applies for a rental license and from what we can tell, it's, you know, okay, we'll issue the license.
When you say you determine it's okay, you determine, you don't send an inspector out then, you just say, oh,
No, we'll look at the exterior. If we haven't received, we'll look in our case file, make sure we haven't received any other complaints. You know, if we have reason to believe there's health and safety issues, we'll address them. But if we don't have any complaints of any sort, then we don't go in and do an inspection.
so there's a state ordinance that says that the city cannot do that? Okay, what is the ordinance? I'm curious. Do you know the number of it, or
Don't know offhand, but I'll find out for you.
does anyone else?
I don't know, it's a fairly new ordinance, it's not really.
We'll ask our interim legal advisor to provide that information for
Okay.
us.
Just out of curiosity, who was
And
the
I used to
legislator?
know it before, but
Which legislator that you
Val.
mentioned?
Valentine.
thank you, Matt.
Wasn't it Valentine?
Yes, it
It
was.
was.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact House bill. It was an amendment to the rental,
Yes,
not good landlord, but landlord provisions of state code. I have to go look it up.
yeah. And I used to know it by heart. I apologize, but it's been 4 years. I've had my mind on other things until recently.
What we may very well do, once you provide us with your legislative recommendations, is then follow up with the legal department and ask them similarly to identify changes in legislation that would allow them to be supportive of the best practices that you have identified.
And I think that during the course of looking at other cities' best practices, that will be one of the things I address. Well, you know, of course, a lot of them don't address occupancy at all, but they do address minimum health and safety standards. Some of the cities have good landlord provisions or a program, that type of thing. And that's something I think I've heard the mayor mention, and something I would like to look at a little closer. You know, I think you're still going to get some people that are not going to want to participate. But I think if we make it attractive enough, perhaps they would. And that would help with the quality of our housing product as it stands now.
And you'll have that to us by September.
At least you didn't say July. Okay?
But ultimately, the example that you cited and that we resonate with, ultimately that's a neighborhood matter.
It is. It is. And it does help when people are involved. You know, it really is helpful when a neighborhood chair is involved with their neighborhood.
Absolutely.
And has a good rapport with a lot of people.
Absolutely.
You know, it is really helpful.
I kind of wonder too, though, if, like, for Southwood, for instance, if they even know there is a neighborhood chair, if they even know there is a program, if they even know there's someone they can reach out to complain to, if they, you know, I think we take for granted that people understand that these services are available, but I would venture to guess that a large percentage of them don't even know that they have that available to them.
And again, that's something we can look at as far as education goes. Like I was saying, with the simple in your electricity bill or in your gas, well, not your gas bill, but your electricity bill, you can provide that information. Hey, did you know? You know, that type of thing, or a blurb on our website or something like that. I mean, that's certainly something, you know, depending on how we can get the best overall coverage for the most people would be really helpful. I think there's a lot of things that people don't know about that the city is responsible for, and the things that they're responsible for. Because many times, one of the things people say all the time, well, I'm not responsible for the park strip. Well, by ordinance, you are. The park strip in front of your house is your responsibility to mow and maintain and keep it looking nice. And when you build a new house, your responsibility is to put in lawn or some sort of type of vegetation, except for the street trees. The city will come and do your street trees. They probably don't even know that. The trees really, the whole park strip belongs to the city, but by ordinance, they're required to maintain it. We get a lot of flack for that because we enforce on that, you know, but we just point out to them that it's your responsibility to maintain it. It's your responsibility actually to shovel your walk right there by your house, the public right of way. So we think we can just buy a property and do whatever we want with it, and that's kind of a misnomer, you know.
Well, in many ways, we do let people do whatever they want with it to the extent it doesn't infringe on the property values and peaceful living of their neighbors.
Right.
And when that line gets crossed is when the city gets involved.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your
Other comments or questions?
I just had a question about the injunction being unconstitutional. You know, it was mentioned here that if it involves health or safety, then certainly there's an injunction available, and an injunction is something that happens, it's allowed in the law. So I don't think we have to look at it as unconstitutional, but if there's a...
I'm referring to the state constitution, not to the federal constitution.
So I'm just curious to know, I'm probably not up to speed on that. What do you mean? So the city can't do something like that?
There are
under the state
property
constitution?
rights
Sure.
that prevent the city from pursuing the course that would be most, in its judgment, most reasonable.
Even in a health and safety situation?
Which is very difficult to define.
Courts have traditionally been loath to...
Depends on the quality of
except in
the
most
legal
egregious
counsel.
If you get a building that's about ready to fall down, we even struggled with that. We had some of those properties on 4800 North that were burned, and we went to the court and couldn't get an injunction to take them down. Yep. And
They
so
say
even
just that it was personal.
you have to allow the property owner opportunity, and they've seen that, interpreted it pretty broadly. So it's been difficult. We've tried a number of times on circumstances like that and been rebuffed, and then had to go find another angle to get it done.
It was amazing to me when we took down the roasted artichoke. We were allowed to take the third and second floor down, but we couldn't do anything to the first floor. And so those were just it's a challenge.
What happened in that case? Because the first court's gone.
Finally, they were able to get the whole thing taken
Finally, we
down.
got
But the
through
first try, the judge said, okay, first two down. Then the top two ones, but nope, you can't touch the bottom.
Oh, wow.
It was weird.
Well, I appreciate your time, and I hope that you'll feel welcome to, talk to me if you have any questions or any concerns. Be happy to help.
You've been most generous.
Is your
It's a
office
pleasure.
No, it's in the other building, and the last name is Walls, Terry Walls.
Walls,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just making sure, Mr. Parker, that she and her staff have hazardous duty pay.
Yes, indeed. She clearly has the toughest job in the city.
This looks anticipatory.
Let's try, where do I sit today?
Now, a discussion led by Brian Maxfield, the planning supervisor, of a request by Barbara Ferry, is it?
That's how I said it. So.
Property manager for Courtyard at Jamestown Associates on an amendment to section 14.47.020. Permitted uses in the specialty support commercial zone to include standard land use number 5950, the retail sale of sporting goods, bicycles, and toys within the zone.
Well, I could start out actually by telling you that Carrie, even though she moved to zoning, did take the certification test for planning and passed that last month, so.
That's
Some
impressive.
good things.
Thank you.
This is a request.
Does that mean you have your design on her, or?
Yeah, now that
He
she-
gave her right to
Real
come back.
planning, that's right. I think she did have options. It said this request looked at adding principally bicycle allowances to the Jamestown, well, it's SSC zone, but the only SSC zone we have is Jamestown. So just so you know, sometimes we'll talk about it in a broad sense, but it really gets specific to that site. The bicycles are listed as use 5952. And if you go to the broader use 5950, which is inclusive of other uses, that also lists sporting goods and then toys and games. So, we felt that was those are reasonable uses, fairly light uses. We wouldn't expect to see Cabela's or anything is going to locate there. So that it's something that would stay fairly small scale. In talking about this, Mike Rohn's here, and he brought up with the neighborhood that there were concerns with including ammunition and firearms in the uses and sporting goods. And so the recommendation for Planning Commission actually came back as use 5950, but excluding ammunition and firearm sales. And so with that modification, the Planning Commission recommended for approval.
Mr. Hales.
So just so that I understand, are they proposing to have some sort of a retail place that will sell bicycles at
Yes.
Jamestown?
Yes, and this is retail sales and services, bicycle sales. I believe they also even do some minor repair, but that's ancillary to the sale.
Is this part of the service they provide to people who live there, or would this be a general commercial?
It's more general commercial. The nature, go ahead.
Is this on the property next to the property at Jamestown? Or is
Well,
it within the walls of
Within the
Jamestown?
Jamestown Square.
Now, is Jamestown
Right.
Square property across the street also? Is that including that?
So on the
Because
east side.
on the east side of University
We're
Avenue.
in Jamestown, so that's not Jamestown Square, right? That's this senior living center.
No, it was
It's all-
between the Senior Living Center and University Avenue.
So the property
It's all
there,
Courtyard.
that is
Assisted
called
living
courtyard,
center
so
is
it's
part-
it's the open
the
ground
larger-
basically right now that you're talking about.
Or the
Well,
existing.
It's in the existing
Or the
shop,
existing.
the existing little, and again,
And the
I don't call it
SSC
strip mall,
zone
but
is
the
where?
existing commercial
It's
area.
that commercial area, just the
Just the
commercial,
commercial area.
right, not including
Not
the
the office
senior center or
complex
the
on the
office
west.
complex.
That's correct.
The two strip malls.
Right.
Yeah, Applebee's and
Right.
the Bally's.
I think it includes the bank too.
Oh,
You know,
the vape company.
And all that property now is in the SSC zone.
Right.
All that property is at this point.
And SSC is fairly close to an SC1. I don't know that you could really see a ton of difference other than the SSC doesn't allow certain uses like the fast food restaurants. I think we've had that on an SC1 down Canyon Road already.
Commander.
Do you have other zones or other areas in the community where we've specifically stricken out sale of firearms or ammunition?
Not that particular use. We ordinance to try and see if there was one, and we really can't find it. We have other zones that strike out particular uses, but not firearms. This would be the only zone that really takes that out of sporting goods.
May I ask Mr. Schreiner, what are our odds if this is challenged?
What? Sorry, I was looking for your
Second Amendment.
Second Amendment states that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It seems like this is an infringement, and I'm having no struggle with that.
And that was Planning Commission's major concern through their discussion. You know, they talked about, does this set precedence? Does this make this, and we'll start excluding it from different areas?
Well, I think that the history of the SSC zone really was starting at desiring no retail at all, and then figuring out what would be ratcheted up to allow some retail. And so again, the underlying theme behind the whole zoning there really was about holding retail at its absolute minimum. Now, whether there are some subcomponents of that land use structure that are inappropriate, I think it's an excellent question. I don't know that it's been adjudicated anywhere, but it's a really good question. Are there some things, if you come from that premise of building up from zero, are there some things that need to be in that first tier? And potentially, firearm sales could potentially be one of those that should be in the first tier.
Just a comment. In general zoning, many zoning categories prohibit the sale of anything. And so as you add additional uses, you're expanding the umbrella of things that can be done within the permitted list of that use. And so in one sense, this is just expanding the umbrella to add a couple things. And it just happens to be that our land use code classified gun and ammo sales in the same general category as toys and sporting goods. It's not uncommon in our zoning code to strike out specific land uses. Again, land use code is a classification system from the 1970s. It is generally, so I don't think it's anything definitive or anything scientific about, well, semi-scientific.
It was an inventory system.
Yeah, it was an inventory system, but there's no national, it's not tied to any national standard.
We blame engineers.
So, what I'm trying to say in one context that that's part of the zoning powers to decide what type of uses, what type of retail is allowed in each zone. It just happens that our classification system put this particular use in a similar category, which on the surface to me seems a little broad: toys and sporting goods and guns and ammo. We have a number of zones that specifically exclude such things as tattoo parlors.
And I guess
bars.
the difference on that is
It's not protected by those.
the Constitution does not specifically guarantee a right to have a tattoo parlor.
Yeah, but if you look at zoning, for instance, you take sexually oriented businesses, which is a free speech right under the Constitution, has been declared as such, and we are, the cities are given the power to limit, not from the city, but limit, you can't ban that from the city, but you can limit in the city where it goes. And you can say sexually oriented businesses will only be in this section of the city, even though it's a constitutional right.
Yeah.
So, again, I think there's ambiguity, but I don't know if it's right. And maybe we're studying, but...
The point is simply that if we approve this, we should be prepared for it to be challenged.
It could be.
Probably sooner than later.
Certainly the other possibility, if the council felt it was a policy issue, would simply be to strike, before you adopt the ordinance, strike that exclusionary language. was recommended by the Planning Commission, was not in the staff report. And so again, that's certainly within your policy purview to hear the comments from the public and then make a decision. So.
The chair is here. Would you care to speak to this, Mr. Rowe?
I would love to speak to this.
Please do. The neighborhood chair, I should be more precise.
That's why I came today. Thank you. Let me draw your attention first to a couple of additional items in the packet that you have, and then I'll address some of the issues. If you look at the Planning Commission staff report it's the second page in the front of that page, you'll notice that under the relevant history, when this zone was created in 1995, it was very limited use in this particular area in my neighborhood. Subsequently, in 2007, 3 very limited uses were added, and then again another very limited use in 2010. So this particular area where these 2 small retail strip malls have been, which constitute probably less than 12 total little retail spaces, have always been very, very limited in what they can and cannot offer to the public. And so what happened was a gentleman who has developed an automated electrical bike system that powers itself, and Councilman Sewell has actually ridden on one, and I was going to bring a picture of him riding on it, but
I've got it here.
Oh, he's got it there to share. But it's a plug-in battery that goes in the crossbar. You can take out and charge in your home, and then it has a electronic gear on the front wheel. And so the only repairs he's doing is if Council Chair Miller were to bring his bicycle in and say, hey, I really don't want to ride up the hill to Tenview High School, I would like some assist, he will take the front wheel off, put a new front wheel with the gear on it, install the battery, and then Councilman Miller can ride up the battery, ride up the hill, using as much or a little automated electronic assist as he wants, either fully driven by the motor, which will go up to 20 miles an hour, or he can pedal some and use some motor. A guy like me would use all electric assist, but that's what it's designed to do. And so he's the inventor, creator of this. He's very limited usage. Retrofitting the bikes costs about $600. He'll buy bikes and then retrofit them and sell them for a couple $100 more than that for people who want to buy them. And so initially, the whole purpose of this was to allow that bike store to go in between the UPS store and the Pier 49 pizza place. Very limited usage. In coming to the Zoning Commission and then the Planning Commission, we were concerned as a neighborhood about the broader use of this 5950 language, which includes sporting goods. We held a neighborhood meeting that was very lightly attended. Councilman Sewell was there, I was there representing our neighborhood, and a vice chair from one of the neighborhoods up on the bench came. And in discussing that, our neighbors are very concerned about something like guns and ammunition. Now, it's true, Councilman Van Buren, that the U.S. Constitution does allow people to own and bear firearms. It doesn't address whether to be sold or not sold. We would prefer not to have that in our neighborhood, which is essentially 99.5% purely residential, very, very little commercial in our entire neighborhood. We don't mind the bike store. It sounds like from the discussion we had at the Planning Commission and what I've heard you here discuss as well, there are some concerns about if you approve a zone of 5950, then try and restrict specific uses, that may create a problem for you. You just mentioned that we might be open to some future litigation about that issue. In our meeting in the neighborhood, one of the ideas that we discussed that we actually recommended, if you'll turn to the back of page 2, the commission report, you'll notice that 5950 is a broad category, and there are actually within that 3 subcategories. We had recommended that the approval be for the 2 subcategories, the 5952, which is bikes and bike parts, and the 5953, which is toys and games, which then completely eliminates the kind of concerns and issues you were facing. And we can defer that to a future date. We can do more legal research. We can do any number of things, but at this point, there's no pressing need to have to allow sporting goods, camping equipment. Those would all be viable things. But we are very concerned about guns and ammo or something that might be likened to it, which we're not aware of at this point. And so in keeping with this particular zone and the history of the very limited uses that have been authorized in this zone, as a neighborhood, we would like to see the approval of the 5952 and the 5953, given the concerns that you've expressed about modifying the 5950 and arbitrarily putting limits in and stuff. We think that that will probably meet the needs of the city and the neighborhood most fully and eliminate or defer any potential litigation for arbitrarily restricting what's allowed within certain zoning criteria. Those are my thoughts. If you have questions.
Mr. Van, you're on.
Just a question on 52 and 53. If it's a bicycle shop, why would the request for the 53 be part of the request?
The property manager, Barbara Ferry, said, you know, as a manager who's trying to find tenants, she would like some additional breadth to be able to go out and find tenants. The property owners are very concerned about what goes in that neighborhood as well, but she thought if we're expanding it at this point, adding toys and games is a pretty innocuous addition, and if we're doing it, it might make sense. The neighborhood doesn't have any particular concerns about toys and games, unless they're games that would blow stuff up, or some of those hostile video games that turn into real life games where you're capturing or attacking might be a concern. Does that make sense?
Mr. Maxfield, have you any comment in response? Thank you, Mr.
You know, I think the nature of a small zone sometimes isn't always the uses allowed, because you'd be hard pressed to argue why one has a greater impact than another. I think the biggest thing on some of these areas is they're fairly small scale stores, 2,500 square foot retail and others. So they're fairly limited in area, and then that usually forces more of a specialized sort of a use. So I think our interest is making these areas viable commercially, that they're not so limited that we got vacant stores because they're looking for that, so such a specialized clientele or something.
Mr. Hales.
So would the applicant have any objection to refining the scope instead of 5950? Put 5952 and 5953 in there?
I can't speak for them, but I believe they said they were okay
We
with
have
that in the
discussed
neighborhood
that.
meeting.
They're amenable to that. That's not their first desire, but she has expressed willingness to accept that.
Or just 52. Mr. Sewell.
Just wanted to give a little feedback from the neighborhood just barely to the north of his. I used to be the vice chair in that neighborhood, and so the boundary is just a few hundred feet north of where Mike's neighborhood boundary ends. I sent an email to the River Bottoms neighborhood list asking about this issue, and I got pretty much the same feedback as what Mike has gotten. There were no issues with toy stores or a bike store, or really even sporting goods, except for the firearms ammunition. Every email that responded had a concern about that. And again, it's not that we don't want to prevent those sales, it's just there's residential pretty much all around where the shopping center is, north, east, and west. And the issue is, do you want those sales next door to where you live, is what the feedback I was getting. So I have a similar concern that Mike just raised. If we think that there might be a last minute change because of legal concerns, I think I would feel more comfortable going with the 5952 and the 5953. And I was there in that same meeting when the applicant mentioned that she was okay with that. But if legally it's not a problem to go the other route and make it 5950 without the firearms, then that would give the maximum
So you
flexibility.
imply that we will just simply defer this until our legal counsel has had opportunity to study it and return with a set of recommendations.
Mr. Chair, I think we've already noticed that for the July first meeting, so if we don't have a response by then, you're free to continue it, but it will be on the agenda.
On the council meeting agenda?
I think the way I
Oh, it
would
hasn't been noticed
propose
yet?
it, Mr. Chairman,
So-
is, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that's correct, I misspoke.
So the
We're
next-
planning on July 17th.
So the next board meeting, we would take it up there.
May I ask a question, Mr. Chairman? I know that there's certain items that are prohibited from being sold within a certain distance of schools and other situations like that. Alcohol, pornography, those sorts of things. I don't know if guns and ammunition would fall in that category or not, but there's a charter school about 350 yards north of this location. There's also an elementary school about the same distance up the hill.
That's why we'd like
and
our
another
legal
high school.
counsel to review the matter and come back with recommendations.
I hadn't heard it discussed at any of the meetings I've attended, but it seemed like that the school issue might be germane.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, maybe my suggestion would be that we prepare kind of two resolutions there,
Exactly.
and so we're ready to go either way.
Or more.
Or more, yeah.
Mr. Maxfield, thank you.
Was that an official motion? Okay.
No, we'll just schedule it for that agenda, that work meeting agenda. Thank you, Mr. Maxfield. And now the further item of the Joaquin Neighborhood Plan, please.
Was there the other item on the Gardner?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, prior to that, you're right. This is Gardner and Associates and PEG Development on text amendments to section 14.21A.0304 of the Provo City zoning ordinance to allow non-residential uses as an optional rather than an required use on the first floor of buildings fronting Center Street east of 100 East and west of 500 West, and on the portion of University Avenue south of Center Street, all within the DT1 General Downtown Zoning District.
Just as a quick summary again, currently we require commercial uses on the first floor along Center Street, University Avenue, through the DT1. Their request was originally to exclude certain areas, principally for Gardner Associates was to exclude east of 100 East and west of 500 West. And then PEG Development, dealing with a site they had south of the health department, excluding from that east side of University Avenue. It's one of those difficult things because as you get into some of the retail use and you're pioneering a neighborhood, you're basically building up your clientele, the population base. It's always hard to be that first retail in. You know, the viability is not quite as strong. And so they're looking at, are there other uses? The other use, non-residential, would obviously be residential use that would go into the first floor. As we looked at that, we, the staff, definitely believe that, you know, that's a free market thing that can be driven that way. That when it's viable, then they'll definitely change over to retail, or that's our option, just because of the change in income possibility that way. But also that we don't need to necessarily have a trigger to do that. We'll just let the market take care of itself that way. I think the biggest element we looked at was the initial design. That the design still have that commercial look to it, because that's an element that's really makes a walkable community. It's just the scale that you would get off that first floor. And so we felt the design's so important to maintain that commercial look, but inside of the windows, you know, if it were residential, then that isn't really a deal breaker this time.
By the way, should this wording read west of 100 East and east of 500 West?
It's outside the historic district.
Excluded Center Street. I believe the wording that came from Planning Commission changed that maybe to east of 200 East.
It actually moved.
You know, the apartment building that's just on the other side opposite the old library, and then the mortuary. You know, right now they would have to have the retail. And that was principally the reason why Gardner Associates asked for the change, because they're having trouble leasing out that first floor of the old apartment building. The article I passed, I apologize, I happened to see this the day after we had the Planning Commission meeting, and so I thought I'd run that off for you. It's out of Urban Land Institute. It's just an article I had, and ran off landscape so you can make notes to the side. I didn't notice that until I printed it off, and it's a little bit tougher to read sometimes, but it does give a lot of the reasoning why you need the flexibility in some of these mixed-use downtown areas.
Although this wouldn't really be, according to, again, the specification here of location, wouldn't really be downtown.
No, it's the one on the
design
east
zone.
But it is in the D1,
It's in the DT1 zone.
Bed development, it's a little bit different, I think, than going east on Center Street even. That one definitely will be more of a core area as the area develops. You know, we think years from now, there's a great spot for some retail uses. It's just whether or not it's viable right now.
Questions?
we're changing this to allow it to happen. So if they decide, they don't have to come back for any kind of zone change. It's more of an option for the developer, because that can be a real challenge if all of a sudden the residents in there say, well, I don't want commercial underneath me. But we're not taking that right of way so that anyone buys that, they recognize commercial could go there.
Right. And it's purely the option of the property owner.
Your design elements would be such that it would be attractive to retail.
Right.
So the idea of saying, for example, one of the situations cited in this article is a place where they had a very deep, at a 60-foot deep building, and they had a mixed-use requirement with retail on the ground level, but they decided to shorten up the retail, put a sound wall in, and put residential behind, with accesses, you know, in strategic locations through that area. Right now, our ordinance would prohibit that. All ground level has to be retail. So again, this gives some options to a developer to try to make a project pencil. Again, there's really good arguments on both sides of this equation. I recognize that, but again, this is what the proposal was really about in the first place. It's trying to provide an interim use until the market caught up.
But there is no obligation on the part of the property owner when the market catches up to make the conversion.
And that's really, I think that's a really good question, and I think part of the challenge, I think, is trying to figure out what's your trigger. When would you say that? Is it retail sales in the area reaching a certain level? Is it population reaching a certain level? What constitutes the trigger by which you tell a developer or a building owner, you now must evict these residential tenants in order to put in commercial?
And that's not.
And that's just, I think that's candidly one of the big struggles, is trying to figure out what is your enforcement trigger.
Yeah, the only thing we thought of is you'd have to review it like every 3 to 5 years and then say, okay, is this still valid? Make a financial justification that
Should
way.
the legislation include a trigger?
I think it's pretty arbitrary how to do that, though. To say a trigger, if we base it on sales, well, maybe that area is not as good as some other place that we've got. All of a sudden, Riverwoods would jump up, and maybe they do really well, and so because the Riverwoods does well, we trigger it in South. That becomes a bit of a challenge at some point.
The ideal on the other end is that you've created such vitality downtown that why would you go retail? Because there's a huge demand for it, but whether that's realistic too.
Would you get more money out of renting to retail than to
Yes.
residential? So it would make sense for them financially to rent out to retail.
Yeah, it goes from a unit to a square
That's
footage.
essentially deferring to the market. And the question is whether we should retain some kind of obligation on the part of the property owner.
And I think that's the key, that if we go to the market-driven, then the market will drive it at some point in time. Retail will be more attractive than residential. If we put a trigger in, then we're kind of arbitrarily doing it, and I don't know, whoever makes that decision can make that judgment. But I think we have to look at it. If we allow retail or residential, we're allowing residential. I mean, it can be residential, it can be residential forever. And I think we've just got to say, do we just trust the market and say when it becomes more feasible for retail, then it'll happen? and we step back and let it happen, or we keep it as it is. See, we just want to keep it retail.
Well, it's not forever because there will be new municipal council.
That's true.
Yeah, there was a discussion whether or not they should just extend through the whole DT1, and yeah, there's some argument to that too, but it pulled back just to those particular sites.
I wonder if we, once it became, if it is residential, and then we may allow it to be commercial or retail, does this allow them to go back to residential should the market change, or do we leave that at the point, say, once you've made the option, it will always remain retail? That's not in the zone at this point. Is it something we want to consider? I don't know once that option is taken. But maybe, I know we had to do that
At Brigham's Landing.
at Brigham's Landing.
Yeah.
We allowed them to go back. Alpine Village went back to residential.
Selected areas.
And maybe they would have to come back. I don't know. That could be a trigger. I don't know.
It seems like we might want to build in some sort of safety for the city, because if they're putting in residential, that's a draw on the city, and if they're putting in commercial, then that's a boon to the city. So I think that at some point, if you had someone who maybe the market is doing well, but they just want to keep with the residential, they don't want to bother with commercial, and the city wants, obviously we want the sales tax revenue, we would appreciate, having that sort of what we had originally planned. I mean, we might want to build something in there, I don't know.
I just know that at these levels of densities, residential does start paying for itself versus lower density.
As much as commercial? I mean,
Maybe not as much, well, that depends on
Just
what
at least commercial, because commercial's taxed at 100%, residential's at 60 or so.
So it may be something that would not necessarily want to force their hand, but at the same time, we're sort of giving up.
Yeah, and certainly implementing it now at least lets us go forward where, reevaluation that we could do later may change it, as we see things occur. This doesn't lock it, the allowance in forever on our end either.
Right. How do you have to take it away in the future?
Well, for new buildings that aren't built yet. But principally be
Remind me what the DT boundaries are right now. Is it down to 5th West?
Paula, can you just rattle those off for us?
What's the question?
The DT boundary, DT1, DT2.
Right.
Well, the DT1.
It jogs all over the place. It's just on University Avenue and Center Street, or east and west, on Center Street, for example.
200 east, 600 on the map.
200 east, 600 west. And on University Avenue,
That first one. Zoom in there. Zoom in the bottom right corner.
so we're essentially just using the walk on both sides.
The darker red one there. So this is just 2 Freedom Boulevard on this edge. I'm sorry, that's DT2. DT1's this larger area. DT2's the more core area. I was thinking backwards, I apologize for that. This is 400 south. This is 200, what's more than that?
600.
600 west.
600 west and 200 east and 500 north up here.
Further questions? This is on the agenda for,
I think it would be on the 17th.
on the 17th. All right.
At this point.
Just to comment, I just really have a hard time. I don't know how we could arbitrarily do a trigger. I think that'd be really hard, Kim. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but to choose a trigger, I struggle with that. I don't know how we can do that.
Well, at the same time, to make it all residential is,
A non-market trigger.
A non-market
We're deciding to let the market trigger.
Yeah, yeah, a
Just to
non-market
clarify,
trigger.
this is for only 2 streets, right?
Right.
Center and University, the whole district.
Right.
Yeah, and the ends of Center Street and the south part of University.
It may be helpful to know that when the downtown zone was rewritten, the former CBD zone required ground floor commercial on every street in the downtown. And through that process, it was determined that that's probably an unrealistic market expectation. And so residential is allowed on many of the side corridors and streets as a ground floor use. So in some ways, this proposal is expanding that a little bit. But the discussion then was that, yes, University and Center Street are core commercial areas that probably need to preserve that way. At that time, that was the discussion.
You might remember a few years ago, we had Randall Mackley come and spend some time with us thinking about the future of our downtown. And when he talked about downtown retail, one of the things he said was your traditional retail is not supported typically by the business community and the tourists that come into your downtown. It's supported by the residents who can walk to those facilities. So your entertainment and restaurant is driven largely by people who come into the downtown from out of the downtown. But your traditional retail is supported by downtown residents. And so one of the strategies he pushed really hard was the further you grow your residential base in the downtown, the more likely you are to have retail success. And so again, there probably does hit, if we believe that economic analysis, then there probably is a point at which the critical mass of downtown is such that ground level retail becomes extremely valuable to a business owner, building owner. We may not be quite there yet in terms of the density and the numbers in the downtown, but again, we've got 170 units going in across the street from us. We've got 40 units down the street from us. We've got another proposal we're looking at now that's about 200 additional units in the downtown. And so again, I think as you begin to reach that critical mass, the market probably will, in some ways, take care of itself, if you believe the Mackley analysis.
Well, one of the best examples I can think of is Larimer Square down in Denver. If you've been there, if you'd gone there 30 years ago, that was pretty dead. Of course, they built a baseball stadium that might have a lot to do with it, but, there's a little synergy that has to occur.
Thank you, Mr. Maxfield. Now would you kindly take up the Joaquin neighborhood plan?
That one I'll pass off to Josh.
Very good. Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks. Would you like me to just provide an overview of the process and the plan at this point?
Please.
In October of 2012, the Community Development Department began the process of developing a Joaquin neighborhood plan, or a small area master plan for the Joaquin neighborhood. It's the second in an ongoing series of efforts to develop small area plans for neighborhoods. The first plan that we worked on is the downtown plan, which after we received the final recommendations of the city center block report and integrate those into that plan, you will be seeing that as well. The Joaquin plan began in October and shortly of 2012, and shortly we convened a citizen advisory panel composed of citizens who attended a first public neighborhood meeting and received other correspondence by mail, and then indicated that they would have an interest in participating on this panel. By conducting bi-weekly meetings with that group and through a lot of internal analysis involving about 3 members of our department, we, over a period of about 9 months, crafted the general recommendations, conducted the research and crafted the general recommendations of the plan, and then spent a number of months vetting that with both internally and with the members of the neighborhood. And then the plan had a curing or a waiting period before we were able to get some definitive action from the neighborhood in moving that forward. And finally, we're able to get a neighborhood meeting sponsored by the neighborhood chair to receive feedback and to give an official sanctioned opportunity for residents to respond in both to staff and to the neighborhood chair in an official capacity. The plan overall, if I could describe it succinctly, it would be that, as we wrote in introduction, that it really is a plan that conceives of a united neighborhood to serve a very diverse citizenry. That it primarily consists of a compact and walkable urban center at the north reach of the neighborhood that provides daily needs for students to allow for car-free living and convenience that makes that a very attractive area and an area where we can continue to decrease the needs for automobile parking and travel and provide increased density adjacent to the BRT node that will serve that area of the neighborhood as well. And then anchored towards the south end of the neighborhood with a focus on reinforcing the existing single-family character of the neighborhood in preserving and adding value to the remaining single-family homes and creating a environment of predictability and reliability to the future of the neighborhood that promotes investment and long-term occupancy, which we feel will be a real positive for the neighborhood. And these two areas of the neighborhood are really mediated through the middle areas of the neighborhood by appropriate transitions, both in terms of land use and in the form, size, and density of housing in that area. And that both areas are really reinforced by their connections to the downtown, and that we hope through a number of interventions and recommendations that are made in the plan to promote easier walking and bicycle traffic through the neighborhood to the amenities in the downtown area, and to really increase the location premium of this neighborhood as a really great place to live, either as a student, an unmarried single student living with roommates, young single or young married couples, retirees, a whole range of demographics with both great neighborhood amenities and easy access to a vibrant and growing downtown. And there are a number of analytical sections and implementation processes that are discussed in the plan to reach that goal.
Splendid. Are there any particular features of the plan that you wish to highlight?
Well, one of the primary one of the maps that's most of interest to residents and to others as we discuss the plan is the map on page 19, which actually is the proposal for the future land use. And that basically delineates what the types of land use and helps us understand what the zones that we would apply to these areas in the future would be. A couple other key recommendations of the plan are to pedestrianize 800 North, to give it more of an emphasis to pedestrians, to provide greater safety for north-south crossing of that street, which is kind of a undergraduate Frogger game right now sometimes as I drive across and somebody's parked 10 feet from a crosswalk and somebody jumps out, with a trench coat and a backpack on. And to really change the character of that street, that it communicates to people traveling there that this is a shared space through the use of raised intersections, bulb outs, by pulling parking back to maintain sight distances at intersections, and instituting protected bike lanes and delineated bike lanes along that corridor as well. It also proposes designated 200 East as a linear park so that we're able to use impact fees and other methods through a capital improvement plan to create bicycle and pedestrian facilities along that street, as well as instituting similar improvements on 400 East, as well as through the neighborhood creating a base set of design guidelines for the public realm when Public Works does improvements there. So we have, as we can use the synergy of those projects and the money we're already spending to create an enhanced pedestrian realm. And it goes all the way down into some small placemaking suggestions, such as reinstituting the concrete obelisk street markers that you may have noticed in the neighborhood. There's one on the corner of Center Street and 400 East. It'll say CS for Center Street and 4S for 400 East. People in the neighborhood feel that those are kind of a unique feature of the neighborhood, and are in some other pioneer neighborhoods as well. And then creating a standard palette of street furnishings, lighting, and other types of amenities from the city's side that will help to reinforce the unique character of the neighborhood. We also recommend adding a set of residential development design guidelines to the current area that will remain residential conservation zoning, so that as residential units are replaced or as infill projects are done, that their impacts to the neighborhood and their design will be able to be regulated in such a way that it maintains and reinforces the aspects that are identified as key to the character of Joaquin, whether they be specific stylistic guidelines, which we think probably less in that direction, more towards the realm of setbacks, massing, variety of fenestration, location of doors, garages, those type of things. And one of the other simple but maybe big moves that we also suggest in the land use section is to both kind of a transportation and a urban design park intervention would be on page 22 to vacate or remove the section of 800 East Street between essentially 100 North and Center Street that runs through the center of Memorial Park, and then continuing Park Avenue, which is about 770 East. Continuing Park Avenue, well, it actually lines up to about the street on the immediate south side in Joaquin, so it actually creates a four-way intersection there. Removes the street that's bifurcating the park, and makes it a little harder or less convenient for traffic to travel 800 North, which happens to some degree now, people trying to get north through the neighborhood and seeing 800 East as a easy cut-through street. We saw that as a way both to mitigate some of that cut-through traffic that doesn't need to be on that street, and also to create a larger, more usable open space in that area. So that's another big recommendation in the plan. But I think the big thing is that it creates a regulatory framework that is predictable for the residents in the neighborhood and removes the uncertainty of the pro-zone process, both for developers who would like to contribute to the neighborhood and develop new product. They have a clear understanding from the get-go what the regulations are, what they are able to develop. And it also provides the neighbors with a long-term understanding of what the future of the neighborhood will be, and removes the uncertainty that can come from approving projects on a per-project basis. And I think that will contribute to the tide we're already seeing of people reinvesting in the neighborhood, reinvesting in homes, and creating a much less transitory neighborhood in the south area of the neighborhood, and then a much improved student area at the north end of the neighborhood.
Very exciting. It's been too long coming, but it's very exciting. Mr. Taylor, where do we go from here?
It's on your agenda.
I'm sorry, wait.
It is on the agenda. It was recommended by Planning Commission.
Yes, I put it on July 1st or July 17th. I think only the 15th, sorry.
It'll be on the 15th.
15th.
July 15th. I suppose one of the questions that your question prompts, Mr. Miller, is there additional public outreach or input, or is there additional discussion forum for the council to get their arms around that in between now and when you finally do approve it? So I suppose, this is one of those things that's of sufficient importance that may warrant answering that question of what type of process do you feel like you need to go through in order to be well prepared for that first public hearing.
Two possibilities are to place the item on the agenda, on the work meeting agenda next, with the open invitation to come and speak about it there, or to do that in the council meeting prior to a vote on the 15th.
This plan has been a subject of discussion at the neighborhood meetings, and that group that participated in creating the plan is well connected, and they've tried to share it as much as they could with others. I think it would still be smart, though, to invite public comment.
And what would your recommendation be?
I think probably in a council meeting that's more accessible to the public.
So let's include it in the council meeting on the 1st of July.
Okay. And as it is essentially a land use legislative item, it would require a public hearing by default.
Yes,
so.
yes. And you'll be there to introduce it.
Somebody from our department.
Technicality, even though we have this initial public hearing on the 1st, because of the statutory noticing guidelines, will be required to have another public hearing on the 15th for you.
Yes, yes.
So I have a question, a couple of questions. The first one is, how much of the area south of 1500 North was already conservation, residential conservation, or did we expand that area?
No,
It
that
was all
area
stayed the same.
of residential conservation is not expanded.
So that stayed the same?
Essentially,
And
there's,
the R16 zone, was that already R16?
yes,
And
that's
just
remained
remaining
R16.
the same, yeah.
That's
same
just
zone.
propagating the existing zoning. There are some incursions along, well, I'd have to look at the map specifically, but there are some areas, as you look at the future land use map, where that line of 500 North is not straight, that there are some incursions into the south of 500 North, specifically in the area of the colony,
Yeah.
which we anticipate will continue in perpetuity to be a
Until-
batching single apartment area, whether or not it gets redeveloped in the future, but that will probably continue to be a multifamily residential area, and that the area along 900 East that's shown in red will continue to serve as a commercial area.
Okay, and then I had one more question, and this is really nicely done, by the way.
Thank you.
Good work. The last question I had was on one of the recommendations, the incentives on the very last page of implementation strategies, where you talk about impact fee reduction zone. Creating this zone is somewhere where we dismiss the costs associated with developing and trying to persuade new developers to the area. That's something where we're going to be looking at impact fees, and so I don't know that we would want to. I don't know if this is asking to designate this zone as a no impact fee zone, but that's something that we need to budget-wise look at to see if we can't increase the impact. So that would actually go against kind of what our ideas for our budget and for having a sustainable budget moving forward is to not do that. So that would be the only thing that
This is simply listing the legal alternatives you have, what would have legislatively to create incentives in the area. I'm not saying that they should or could,
even asking that.
Or asking that, it's just saying these are things you could do. Just basically just delineating those as both impact fee reductions and tax increment financing as two methods that could be used if they were so desired. But we also feel that the development in this area and the impact fees that would return to would be gained from development would be very useful and necessary tools in completing a lot of the infrastructure and public improvements that we contemplate in the area, both in terms of streets and transportation and parks and
the strip park, the linear park.
The linear park, and even the plan recommends some type of additional open space along the 800 North as well. So that's definitely not a recommendation that should happen, but just delineating options.
Mr. Van Buren.
There was some talk about the enhancement of Second East. Was that coordinated with the bicycle master plan?
Yes.
It sounded like it kind of fits. It sounded like it worked.
It lines up with the corridor that's designated as a bicycle boulevard in the bicycle master plan.
Good. In fact, I assume that's true of all of the bicycle-related amenities.
Correct. Well, we were a little bit ahead of the adoption of that. We've reconciled the recommendations of this plan with the bicycle master plan.
I invite a motion to place a presentation and public hearing of the Joaquin Neighborhood Plan on the agenda for our municipal council meeting on the 1st of July, and a public hearing in anticipation of a vote on July 15th.
So moved.
Is there a second? Mr. Van Buren, thank you. Mr. Hales, thank you for the motion. All in favor? Thank you. Passed unanimously. Thank you very much. Well done. Well done.
Just a reminder, Mr. Chairman, if the Joaquin neighborhood were its own city, it would have roughly the population of Saratoga Springs. So it gives you a little sense of what we're talking about in terms of numbers and density in that area. If you were simply to take all the residents there, they would fit in Saratoga Springs.
To make sure that's part of the presentation.
And it has
gives you a sense of scale.
Has the densest and a number of the top 10 densest census blocks in the state.
Yeah.
So
excellent.
very interesting.
Yeah, that's very important context. Now we extend to Mr. Glauser. Straskovich. Invite you to take up items 9 and 10, an overview of the proposed South Downtown Community Development Project Area Plan and the recommendations of the task force on the city center block redevelopment.
Thank you. I might just say another insight into what we talked about. A few years ago, we had a study done down that within a 1 mile radius of Center and University Avenue, we have about 32,000 residents, which is many more than you have in similar 1 mile radii at the center of Albuquerque, Boulder, Palo Alto, and numerous other cities. So it's a little bit unique. I'm here first of all to give you a short briefing on an item that's coming before you on July the 1st and to try and answer any questions. It's an item that can sometimes cause some confusion and consternation among residents, and that is the formation of a new CDA, new Community Development Project Area. This would be in the area of South Downtown. Let me just walk you through a few slides. I'm planning to only take about 10 minutes. If there are questions, we can take those to help you be prepared on July 1st when you have this public hearing. Next slide.
Clicker should be.
Oh, thank you.
Brian, would you kindly dim the lights here? Thank you.
Is that too dim? Maybe we
That's
Under Utah law, when you form a new CDA like this, it requires action first by the redevelopment agency and then secondly by the city council. If you choose to approve that project area, you are really are approving the project area plan, which has been drafted. There's some variation of what's been drafted. And the RDA would first pass a resolution, and then the council would immediately thereafter pass an ordinance also approving the plan. Just to tell you a little about how we've been disseminating information. This is an area with over 700 individual properties. It includes about almost 250 acres. I think you've all seen the map, I hope you have, running from about 100 south down to 920 south. It goes beyond 920 south at the northwest corner of the mall. And it runs from first east westward to either third west or fifth west, depending on how far south you are, to pick up the area. And the idea of this is primarily to respond to the development opportunities that exist in that area, with that being a front runner, changes coming in or downtown, those kinds of things. We have notified people and tried to do our best to let them know what this is all about. Began by a state mandated mailing to the 700 plus property owners, just notifying them of the hearing. That tended to scare people a little bit because they get the legalese, and so we followed that up with some other notice. Well, we did a newspaper notice of the same thing, and also as required by law, we posted on state and city websites. Then we followed up with a postcard to those property owners again, inviting them to an open house last Thursday, which we held downstairs. An hour and quarter, actually. Several people showed up early. We had about probably 20 to 25 people show up for that, and we were able to discuss it, answer their questions, reassure them of what this is about, what it's not about. We've also had quite a few phone calls, emails, people dropping by the office, and other ways of trying to answer people's concerns and questions. And I think for the most part, people are satisfied that this is not something that they would oppose or that is should be perceived as a threat to them. I hope that'll be the case when we come on the hearing on July 1st, but I guess we'll just see. We've also provided some printed handouts as well as copies of the draft CDA plan. I don't know if that draft CDA plan has reached you yet or if it'll come as part of your July 1st packet. I'll talk a little bit more about it here. What this is about, again, is carrying out this existing general plan and zoning of the area. That's what we tell people. This is just another tool to help the city actually fulfill its own general plan and bring about tender development of the zoning in the area it calls for, particularly in that interim TOD zone that was created about 3.5 years ago now, to cover the area from front runner up to our DT1 and DT2 zones. And has everybody seen this map? Should I take a minute and just describe the area a little bit? Please do. Okay. This is 300 west. This is 500 west. You have 100 South up here. Just north of this area is the Center Street CDA that we created about a year ago. This is 100 East, of course, of course, the tracks. There's a mall. And the way the boundaries were chosen for this were to look at the area that seemed to have potential for redevelopment and transit-oriented development. Now, there are areas along the fringes that we probably wouldn't want to touch with that kind of development. They tend to be some of the more stable single-family areas, but we've drawn the boundaries as streets rather than the back lot lines. Transition between areas that might be suitable for redevelopment, areas that we want to keep stable, tends to run at mid-block. And so just for the sake of simplicity, we've drawn that lot lines. We've also left out a small area here north of the mall, which seems to be pretty stable, multifamily and single-family residential. There wasn't any need to jump to the next street to catch that. The heart of the area, of course, is the front runner station here. And one of the things driving this is the level of interest which is developing in doing new redevelopment in response to front runner being there, particularly transit-oriented residential development. Okay, when we designate an area as a CDA, that makes it eligible for us to then do tax increment financing. Now, this is a two-part law. The law states that you first of all need to designate an area. And then once you designated an area, as we want to do on July 1st, then you can come back and do deals in that area, redevelopment deals. And if you can get the approval, first of the city council, the school district board, and the board, and the county commission, and the board of essentially the Water Conservancy, each of those can choose to opt in or not opt in with their share of the tax increment that a new development would generate. So it's a two-part deal. This is just, by designating the area, nothing really changes. All it changes is we have the potential then going back and doing deals in the area for various tax communities participate. But we get this first 3 or 4 month stage over with now for a large area, and then are ready to go as individual developments might come along. We've been emphasizing with everybody that's asked that this is not a tax increase, because that's the first question people ask. They see it as some kind of attempt to raise taxes or assessment on property, especially when they hear this word tax increment, which is kind of an odd term. So we explain it's only about a way of temporarily for several years reallocating the new property tax that new development would bring into the area. And the only time taxes will raise will be when someone builds something new on it, for all intents and purposes. I suppose things could creep up a little bit. The market for land in the area gradually improves. But by and large, this is nobody's going in and proposing new tax levy. The other question we get asked a lot is, are we going to be forced to sell our property? Of course we're not. Senator Bramble took that out of the law, the state law, several years ago, the ability to even think about doing that kind of thing. Except in the extreme case where one of you may have land to be sold to a redevelopment agency, and then they say you do go through a condemnation process in those really rare situations. So no one's forced to sell. If someone sells property, it will be because they've elected to sell property to participate. I'd also like to point out that Provo currently has 5 other CDAs and 3 older type redevelopment agencies that were created under an earlier law. So this is not something new or unusual or unique to this part of the city. I mentioned these steps already, but you'd be asked, there will be a very specific process, order of business that will be outlined on the agenda. We'll have Randy File, who is a redevelopment counsel, specializes in this kind of work, attending the meeting and seeing to it that we dot all the I's and cross all of the T's as we go through the process. And then if you're feeling good about it, at the end of the meeting, we would have the adoption of a resolution. Any questions I can try and answer about anything? Either I've talked about or I haven't talked about yet. I didn't really say anything about what the plan contains. Basically, you want me to take just a minute and hit on some high points there? Are we okay for time?
That depends on what follows.
Well, that's going to take some time too.
Yeah. Why don't we
Well, let me just say, some of the key points that we're looking for and that we're telling people will be are covered by this plan is trying to accomplish will be in the areas of enhancing employment, better access to goods and services, improved tax base, better and wider housing opportunities, and reinforcing downtown as the center of Utah County. And general standards to be applied in doing this have to do with the general character of the area and what we're trying to accomplish there. It has to do with building orientation and facades, getting this urban feel to the buildings built out to the sidewalks. We're talking about in other areas. Dealing with parking by trying to put whatever off-street parking there is, tending toward parking structures with it for higher density development and trying to hide it from the street. Making streets, particularly streets like Freedom Boulevard, more pedestrian friendly. Paying attention to the need for open space to complement the increased densities that will be seen. And finally, sustainable development, both economically and environmentally. Those are some of the kinds of things we're talking about. Okay. If you do hear from constituents, feel free to refer them to us prior to the hearing. We would much rather try and satisfy people's concerns prior to the hearing in the interest of time and everything else. Or we'll be ready to do that.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments?
I just have one question. A CDA, now, is that a time, is that a certain time period? I know we talked about the tax increment being available for a certain time period, but as we create this, is this for a certain period of time?
There is no time specified in the plan or in state law for doing the CDA. The time becomes a factor when you negotiate individual deals. You could pull a CDA, cancel it later on, but our recommendation is just keep it open-ended as long as there are needs in the area. And if you want to talk about tax increment will be taken for 5 years or 10 years, make that case by case for individual projects that may be done in that CDA.
So the tax increment is then, it's limited for a certain period of time, but it seems to me like once it starts, somebody starts, does the whole thing go?
It's whatever you negotiate, or the redevelopment agency negotiates with the more tax increments.
Because don't we have a CDA we're starting to lose that opportunity to use that tool?
Yeah, that's an old one, and part of the reason for doing this is we have an old RDA done in the 80s, I think, along University Avenue, another one on Center Street. Center Street one expires after 2015. The University Avenue one goes about 10 more years, but we're already seeing developers saying there's not enough potential increment left in that area, and therefore let's in the area. So what Financial Center, the Zions Bank one, is probably the main active CDA that we have around. And there we negotiated with the school district, et cetera, to take a percentage of the new tax increment for 12 years. And that was all by negotiation with the taxing communities. It could have been 15, it could have been 20, it could have been 3, but that's what everybody agreed on. Okay. The next item we have then. As you know, we've gone through a fairly extensive process this spring regarding the redevelopment of the city center blocks here. And we brought in a great consulting team that's done some really fine work for us. They completed their work about 3 or 4 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, I think it was. And about 2 weeks ago, we had a final meeting of the task force on city center block redevelopment. This is the volunteer committee that was put together in December. The primary objective of advising the council on how you might proceed with regard to this block after seeing what the consultant did, providing feedback for the council, the consultant, and so on.
I'm just going to turn this up because it needs to be picked up by the mics.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, let's go to the next slide. These are the citizens who agreed to serve on this task force. We have 2 of them with us here tonight, Ray Beckham and Mike Bonomo from Downtown Provo, Inc. There were several others, as you see listed here. We tried to get a good cross-section of people from across the community. as well as in the immediate area here downtown, because this is a block of concern to more than just downtown stakeholders. And we appreciate the efforts that they've all put into this. I should maybe say, I'm sure Ray is here ready to respond to any questions or comments you may have if you want to hear straight from them, and Mike too, if you want to hear straight from the horse's mouth how the task force felt about it.
We will ask both of them.
Okay. I'm going to try and represent how I understood their conclusions to be, and stated those in a memo to you, which I've also shared with the committee members. We started with some general observations that the task force made. First one, they wanted to really stress this idea that we're not working in a vacuum here in the city center block. And this came out from some citizens that came out to the charrette as well, that whatever we do here has an impact on a larger area, and we need to keep that in mind. That the city center block is part of a larger area. I neglected to mention that Steve Hales is also on the task force, and Gary Winterton participated in this most recently. Steve, at the time we organized the committee, was chair of the, I think you were chair of the landmarks committee, weren't you? And that was largely his representation. Okay, keeping with this idea of remembering the broader vision, the task force's council will not lose sight of the context. Again, look at what's going on across the street and what we're doing on this block and how it would affect what's going on across the street. Whether it's across Center Street, where you have a fairly, hopefully that will soon have a more active, thriving commercial district, or whether you're talking this other side of First South, which is still largely a residential neighborhood. They also advised we employ the principles of the Downtown Provo Placemaking Best Practices Handbook, and you should all have a copy of that. That would be this one. This is a book that has really application beyond these two blocks and suggests some ideas from the consultants that we found to work successfully across the country. And as we focus on them and apply them to the Provo situation, I feel like that's a good, almost like a Bible for what we do downtown. And then there is concern that we are able to reach out to the broader community with both this vision for this block and with the best practices for how to approach the downtown in general, so that as the city maybe does things a certain way, people understand why we're doing it, why we're saying yes to certain things and no to certain other things. So that's something that we want to give more attention to in the future. Let's talk about the city center block itself now. The 2 acre, the 2 block area, really 8 acres from 5th West to 3rd West and from Center Street to First South. I'm just going to touch on 7 major concepts that came out of this process. First one was a fairly strong recommendation that we ought to reopen 400 West in some fashion. Now that's probably not going to be to open it as an 80-foot right-of-way as it once was, 84 feet. Or as a street that would be there for through traffic. It may be a private street. The block develops with a private developer. It may make more sense for that developer to continue to own the street, to keep it open generally, but have the ability to close it off for special events that may occur through there. This is, we have in here a few sketches that were done by the consultants of what things might look like, and they are strictly suggestions. There are a lot of ways these things could be put together. This would be the Covey Center on the right, and 400 West running here through the left part of the property, with then buildings lining the street. They proposed having a larger plaza where the amphitheater is at the Covey Center now, the outdoor events, and that could easily be close the street, or keep it open most of the time so that shops and others that may have the interior and front on that 400 West would be able to patrons. They also talked about the importance of pedestrian penetration through the block. The idea that right now the city center block is kind of a barrier for people wanting to get from First South to Center Street, and that's got to change if this is going to be an active, thriving district. People need to be able to get around on foot. And that's why they show in their suggested ideas some pedestrian pathways cutting through the block. They don't need to be straight through, but they should be fairly direct for people to get through and be able to penetrate the block. It's not just something where you walk around the outside, but you really don't take advantage of the potential for activity on the inside. We talked a lot about Center Street buildings. Need, especially here east of the Covey Center. We're assuming the Covey Center would stay. There was some discussion about that, but by and large, everybody's assuming, for many reasons, the Covey Center will stay. These buildings will be built to the sidewalk, as existing storefronts are. The ground floor space, even though it may be offices or something until the retail market strengthens, will still be developed in a storefront form, so they could easily be converted to shops. You can talk about fine-grained detail. The rest of Center Street was not developed, for the most part, in large, massive developments. It was over time. And as you look at the individual buildings, they may have been built 10 or 20 or 30, 40 years apart. And that contributes to the character that we're trying to have for this walkable retail district of this end of the street. And so, as this area develops, it probably would not develop as individual little shops, one building at a time, but it should have much that same feel on the street, that fine grain we talked about. Here's another illustration. This is the entrance to that street, the Covey Center, with a new marquee on it, and new buildings where the city center now sits along Center Street, northwest. And you feel what kind of buildings would contribute to that. There was fairly strong feeling that city offices ought to stay on the block. Now, the market research part of this project found that there's probably not a very strong market for spec office space in downtown Provo. Not to build a lot, probably not on this block. But if the city center stay, that's the very major contributor to office space on the block, and the city needs to have its offices somewhere. Part of the process, the consultants talked to a variety of developers who have shown interest, and virtually all of them have felt that having the city center here would be an important part of the block as kind of a first tenant, maybe for the first phase of the block. Just in this suggested diagram, the city center is shown out on this corner, the northwest corner, where Firestone and the Hamburger Drive-In now sit. And there was a lot of discussion also about the importance of this being a legacy civic building, not just another office building, but something with the impact of the historic courthouse or the tabernacle or some of those other buildings that have been in our community for many years, built at a time when there was a smaller population and certainly not the wealth that we have today in order to undertake those projects, and yet they found a way to do those legacy kinds of projects. And so the feeling is, if and when city center stays here somewhere on the block, it needs to have that kind of impact and that kind of lasting quality. This is a drawing the consultants did of what such a building might look like on the corner of Center, or Center and Fifth West.
Paul, may I ask, is that inclusive of police department facilities, fire department?
We might refer that one to our task force. My understanding was that it ought to at least be the offices. Police and fire add another, I think it's about 50% the size of the building, and quite a bit more to parking. So the feeling was that wasn't as essential as city offices. We didn't really talk specifically also about Justice Court and whether it should come back to this block or go somewhere else. But there ought to be some fairly major presence on the block by city offices. Another main principle was the need to hide off-street parking. You really don't want to waste good street frontage in an important part of the city like this with parking lots or parking garages. And although you may phase into all the parking that you need as the project itself takes place in phases, in the end, the plan not to call for parking to be either in structures or maybe surface lots in some cases, but surrounded by buildings, and so that no one has their apartment or condo or office facing on one of these parking lots. And that's a secondary point too. You see these buildings, these are residential buildings. They're narrow buildings, and that's because they're not a double-loaded corridor, as you typically see in residential. It's a building that fronts on the street or fronts on this new alley pedestrian way and backs onto the parking garage.
So there'd be no windows on the inner core.
You could have back windows, but not the front of the building.
So the
Nobody's-
front windows wouldn't look out onto the parking garage, but the back windows, but there would be back windows.
Back windows would look out that way, sure. And then quite a bit of attention was given to this need for the transition to the neighborhood, especially along the south side of the block. We'll talk a little bit also about down First West and the additional work that was added as far as streetscaping First West in general. So again, we have fairly relatively moderate scale residential facing on First South. So there's a smooth transition to the traditional single-family homes on the other side of the street. They're not all used as single-family homes now, but we're assuming that some of those homes have some really nice character and they would stay for foreseeable future. So we need to complement that and acknowledge their existence. Finally, there was good discussion about Fifth South and how it is now acting as a barrier between the city center. Fifth West, thank you. A barrier between the city center. Oh, that's Fifth South. It's supposed to be Fifth West. Between the city center and Pioneer Park. It became kind of a joke during the charrette how dangerous that intersection is. That's not fodder for a joke, but the consultants came and said, how does anybody ever get across there? And yet we have farmers market that relies heavily on parking across the street. And they have a traffic engineer who came out as part of the work and are very familiar with how you deal with situations like this in an urbanist or an urbanist kind of situation.
Just anecdotally, the farmers market has to hire a crossing guard because it's just a little too scary.
Yeah. So we need to think about what can be done to deal with that problem here, so this does function more as a single unit as much as that's possible. And there are some things that can be done, and the consulting team visited with our public works department. And they, I understand they reached consensus pretty much on what could and should be done. It is a state highway, so we need to get the state recon involved. It's something we need to pursue.
Do you know what that consensus was?
I'm sorry, what?
Do you know what the consensus was that they reached?
Yeah.
Oh.
Essentially, it was this. Here's the intersection now, and they said, you know what we really need to do, first of all, is put more pedestrian area right out at the corners. See how we kind of fill in some green down here. And we'll talk in a minute about what to do with First South. Part of that will involve pulling the curb on the north side of the street out down south about 25 feet or so. And so that gives you more pedestrian area as well. They also said, you know, you really don't have your crosswalks marked very well. This kind of a pattern is much more, it gets the attention of drivers much more, and it's probably not too early to be thinking about some kind of a yellow blinking light to assist pedestrians getting across the street, and eventually going to a semaphore, a red light situation there over time. And it's my understanding our Public Works Department was in agreement with those things and thought that was all reasonable to do without impeding traffic and do it on Fifth West. Part of what's going on here, you got to keep in mind, is First South is not the street that it was even just a year or two ago. Much less traffic because it doesn't go through University, of course. So it can be a much slower street. There's much less traffic turning on and off of Fifth South as there might have been just a few years ago too. So the needs just aren't the same as what they were. Let's talk a little about the 100 South Linear Park. I mentioned this idea of moving the northern curb to get it down to a narrower street. This is the way the street is laid out here, and I apologize that you can't see it too well. It's in this other larger volume that I think you've all received a copy of as well. But the proposal is to take that down, and our engineering department has agreed to this, to take it down to, instead of having a center lane, 10-foot, 12-foot lanes, 8-foot parking on the side, and bike lanes, get it down to a slower street so that bicycles can flow with the regular flow of traffic and you don't need a separate bike lane. Put an 8-foot parking lane on the south side of the street and two 10-foot lanes here. There's also been discussion about whether we could put another 8-foot parking lane on the north side, which would certainly help the parking situation and would help to slow down traffic. So cars slow down when they're passing parked cars. So depending on whether you added that parking lane or not, you would wind up adding about 25 or 30 feet of pedestrian area on the north side of the street by moving that curb out. So what do you do with that space? They recommended a series of what they call outdoor rooms, a linear park connecting it all together in that wider width, even all the way across to the streets and all across Fifth West. But along the way, creating some unique places, each one a little different. And they suggested what some of these rooms, these outdoor rooms, could be. This would be where buildings would be at some point in the future. Property line. Now they said well, maybe with some trellises or something to provide a sense of enclosure, which is so important in the pedestrian area. This is an example where you could have a sitting area, and maybe you have a water pump bringing water up out of the ground for kids to come along and pull around. It's something to bring some activity and get people walking up and down the street, both residents and others. Another such area might be a bioretention garden where you're able to capture some of the runoff from neighboring properties, which are now parking lots and someday would probably be buildings. Bring that water in and use it to actually irrigate a little district along there. But all along the street you would have these rows of trees demarcating that area separate from the sidewalk and what's off of the sidewalk. There are a few other examples that they suggested on how to do this, what some of these rooms might look like. They also suggested, though, that just as you are standing at Fifth West and looking east, you've got a pretty clear view of a beautiful new temple, and that's a vista that people would be drawn to as pedestrians. Maybe we need to think about doing something for people going the other direction. On the west side of Fifth West, they suggested maybe some kind of a column. They said maybe you harken back to your Olympic roots and put up some kind of a fire and ice kind of thing with a cauldron or something. It was just one idea that threw up. But something so that people are drawn to walk both directions on the street. It doesn't just kind of trail off into Pioneer Park at the west. Okay, next steps. The task force was pretty strong that we ought to go ahead with an RFP, request for proposals, to identify a preferred master developer. We think that there are probably at least 4 or 5 of those out there. Near the end of the process, we started to hear from a few out-of-state developers.
One from Canada.
Right, there was one from Quebec. There's another from San Diego. Don't know that they'd be any better than our local developers, but the fact that there's that level of interest is cause for some hope that we would find something really high quality. There are some key considerations that ought to be put into reviewing developer proposals. First was, of course, having a plausible financing strategy, especially for a new city office. The task force was very firm that that's the first question to answer. If we can't find a plausible way to get a new city center office building out of this, certainly without a tax increase, then we probably shouldn't be going forward. But we're going to rely on the creativity of developers to suggest ways of doing that within the constraints that we have as a city. If we can't do it, maybe put everything on the shelf for a while, but hopefully that's not the case. Secondly, you want to, of course, look at the design and make it very clear to the developer that you're looking for proposals that conform to these essential best practices. We've done a lot of effort to try and identify them. And then thirdly, sensitivity to the surrounding downtown context and making sure that we aren't doing this in a vacuum or somehow without thinking about what's going on. There's a feeling that there is considerable momentum by virtue of having come up with these documents recently, and also a pretty favorable financial environment. The economy is going pretty well. Interest rates are still fairly low. Money is available. This is something that condition that may not last a lot longer. Consequently, we need to move forward with the RFP. And then finally, in these reports, they suggested, for the most part, they said, you've got a pretty good downtown zoning district for the kinds of things that we're talking about doing here. There are a few relatively minor things that could be tweaked in the zoning ordinance and probably ought to be dealt with fairly soon. Maybe one of the most graphic examples is the way that the step back is now working on buildings on Center Street. You know, about a year ago, we amended the zoning ordinance to say you still need to step back buildings above the third floor, but only 20 feet, and you don't have to step back on the side streets. The problem that creates, we'll see here very soon with the Cowboy Partners project across the street, where because they want to put a tower on the corner of the building, small tower, and yet they have to step back from the street. It gives you kind of an odd-looking tower, which is not right out on the corner of the building, but it is right at the street around the corner of Third West. So, and they pointed out that the night block and the bank tower there at Center and University could not be built under our current zoning. Is that really what we want? So that's one example of where zoning might be used.
Night block could be because of the exception for uninhabited spaces for towers and stuff.
For uninhabited?
Uninhabited space.
Well, they're proposing we ought to be looking at a little bit more substantial towers, 30 feet on the side.
I think right now the zoning would permit it if it wasn't habitable space.
Well, I'm not familiar with the particulars, but Cowboy was told they could not build a tower that they wanted to build, which we thought was probably the best thing to do.
Go double check the codes, but that's my understanding.
So anyway, there are a few things to deal with there. And that concludes the presentation. I'd invite Mike or Ray to share any other thoughts that they think need to be emphasized, or maybe Steve or Gary, who are also present for these meetings.
From a downtown Provo perspective.
Mr. Bilmo, you want to come to the front, please?
Microphone, I guess.
I guess we'll speak up.
Usually have a loud voice anyways, but from our perspective, this project, going through the plan, with the location of where it's at this end of downtown, it's really, you look at it right now and it needs some revitalization. This is the first thing you come in and you see when you're getting off the freeway, and right now it's not where it should be or where it needs to be, in my personal opinion. So what I thought was very beneficial to downtown Provo is the look and the feel that will be here, and also the fact that it ties in Pioneer Park and makes it more usable. That's really going to be very beneficial, because it almost seems like right now it's two separate things. You have your park and then you have your downtown areas. So we are very supportive of it, and excited to see it come to fruition if it gets to that point. So if there's any questions for me, our organization, that's, I guess, our scope on it. So
thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
Mr. Beckham.
I have a long-term love affair with downtown Provo. I got my first job 68 years ago. I was the advertising manager for Taylor's department store. And I've been on many committees since that time for downtown Provo. I headed a program for the Chamber of Commerce called the Provo Economic Development Committee for about 5 years. I was the founding president for the Downtown Alliance, and all has me involved in the Downtown Beautification Committee for the last 5 years. So I love downtown Provo, and it was an honor to be asked to work on this committee, and this committee worked hard and did a lot of discussion. When I was first asked to be on this committee to think about revitalizing these two blocks, I was totally negative. I just did not believe that it was the thing to do. I love this city center that we had. I was on a committee that helped design it and plan it and promote it, 40 years ago. I love the architecture. But during these meetings, we've learned a lot about our needs in the city. We've learned a lot about emergencies and what might happen if we had a serious earthquake in this area.
efficiency of city government. A lot of things we've learned and talked about, discussed and questioned. And out of these kinds of discussions, I have become converted to the idea that we need to do something. These 2 blocks could provide a great deal of tax revenue for us. These buildings need serious upgrading. And so I think all I can add is that in the last few months, during these intense discussions and presentations, I think our entire committee became totally convinced that something needs to be done. And if you have any questions, I think we can answer them. Gary?
Yeah, I appreciate what Mr. Beckham. 2 things that I was really impressed with was when we talked about creating a legacy building. This was a legacy. I remember when it opened myself, and it was considered one time maybe a legacy building. No, I don't know. It's just a matter of what changes and the things at the time. When we talk about creating a new legacy building, I don't know that it's a challenge to deal with it 50 years down the road again. So I think that's something that we need to look at, because we don't have the materials for these county courthouse like we do in the past. Those are different. They're built differently now, and so I remember this was a great building at the time when it was an icon when they built it. Another thing that I know Ray was really concerned about, and I think one of his first concerns was the financing and bringing it forward. We're in a challenging time, and I know that we talk about a new energy department building, and we know we're dealing with the school board issues, and I know that was probably Ray's. That was the first thing he brought up, was how do we deal with that, and so it's a challenge that we're going to be facing.
So my question is kind of along that. Where did your committee, did you come to a resolve as to what you would suggest as far as financing goes? And then my second question is about the police. Did you talk about where should our police be located if not here?
We talked about several different areas, Kim. First of all, in the financing, the first thing the committee decided was that this is not the right time, nor is this the right project for a bond issue. We felt that a bond issue would go down the tubes. I, for one, would have a difficult time selling the bond issue. On the recreation center, I was part of that program, and I was enthusiastically involved and supportive of the bond issue for the recreation center. I would not be that excited about a bond issue for a new city center. So that was one of the first things that we got over, and that was that the developer would have to come up with some way for us to finance the municipal part of this 2-block development. Perhaps a lease-buy arrangement, or we would lease the building for 20 years, like the county did on the county building. I'm not sure you remember this, but the county proposed a bond issue for a new county building, what, 20 years ago? 20 years ago. And, well, more than that. And the voters turned it down. Even though the committee kind of proved that we needed more space and all that, the voters turned down the bond issue for the county building, so the county commissioners found a developer. They built the county building. The county leased it for a certain number of years, and now they own it. And something like that might be possible as one of some alternatives that we discussed. What was your next question?
And the police. Did you talk about where you took the police?
We talked about several areas for fire and police. Paul would have more information about that than I have. We talked about it, but we only heard 1 or 2 alternatives. I think Paul would be able to talk about several other possibilities that are on the horizon.
I wanted to mention as well, the plan, of course, hasn't been given to a developer yet, but there are a lot of things that they envision on these 2 blocks, in addition to the city center and the Covey Center. A hotel property on one corner, a lot of housing, other little retail things. So I think the hope was that when we get a developer, they'll find that the development potential of the block is so valuable that it makes it so that we can almost get our city center either very cost effectively or have some kind of a lease agreement where it's financially advantageous for the city. We did talk about, I think the mayor's talked too, about some other possibilities for a public safety building, maybe the courts building that the state courts are wanting to sell or trade into the city. That might end up being a good building for public safety just because it's about the size, but I don't know that there's been any decision finally what will happen there. But I don't think they envisioned having public safety divisions on the 2 block area.
Correct.
It's plain there's a lot of work left to do to solve all of these dominoes. You know, each project, each issue seems to rely on another issue being resolved.
And what we saw today on these, what you have in the booklet that you have, the developer may come up with something entirely different. These are just merely recommendations and what we saw, but he may have other ideas. It would be much more, probably different from what we saw today.
Would this be a series of developers or one? I guess it just depends on who answers the.
Yeah, our thinking has been that we need to identify one master developer who assembles a team that maybe has a residential developer or 2 office developer or a retail developer, maybe a movie theater or whatever, hotel developer. And so, but they all work under, we're dealing with basically one entity as our partner.
We met one developer, for example.
Excuse me.
We met one developer who, that's all they do is come in and redevelop city blocks, just like this. That's all they do. And they're very successful at what they've done.
The other consideration in the cost, and this isn't the silver bullet that solves everything, but there are some pretty significant costs of staying in this building in terms of energy and continued maintenance and upkeep. Those have to be considered as we think about a replacement. But that will certainly help to offset the cost of leaving.
We also talked about some synergies maybe with the school district. You know, they have a building like our county or our council chambers that they use one night every 2 weeks, and we use it one night every week. And so maybe they could have their office there, and we could have some shared facilities that might cut back on the cost. There are some other entities like that.
And there's enough room to house all city offices and the district offices in the same corner.
You can really look at, nobody has examined putting district offices in here yet. I don't know if the city's actually close to the district.
So just be sharing the chambers.
Sharing the chambers and maybe persuade them to go a little taller. Why not?
Okay, well, again, it would be really helpful to know if you have any misgivings about the direction we're headed with this. Our thinking otherwise is to assemble a request for proposals and start to see what we get back from developers. Maybe get that out.
I invite anyone with misgiving to make that known.
My main concern is more infrastructure than it is, redesigning the center block. It's my focus would be on making sure that we have updated public works facilities and a fleet facility and the things that we absolutely have to have before doing city center. I mean, I love the layout. I love Placemakers, what they've put forward. But having gone through the budget, having gone through all the real needs of our city, if we can address the capital improvement needs for public works and for fire and some of these things and our police, obviously that would be one of the big motivations for me, would be getting our police in a place where they felt like they could really function well it doesn't sound like this addresses the police, they would be put, somewhere else. And maybe it would put them in a better situation, and that would be a reason, probably, maybe to move forward. But my main concerns, that's my misgiving, or my main concern would be, can we update and do our capital improvement projects? And this is would be my own personal first priority when I consider all the other needs that our city has right now.
We discussed this in great lengths, Kim. But, the bottom line simply was that we would have to provide those facilities as part of our total city needs. But we didn't think it was our place on this particular committee called the Center Block to decide where they would be going, what that would happen. Certainly, that was a big concern.
This was designed to facilitate the improvement of public services. That was one of the main reasons.
Yeah, they really
need
something.
And just back to the original purpose for why we've gone through this effort over the last 5 or 6 months, it's really to just introduce the dialogue, start the discussion. What is possible? What would be important to us as a city in terms of design and other factors? And get a market study then to see if there's a prospect for it making sense. But only after we actually have developers come back and say, here's what we could do for it. Then when we have a clear understanding, you can start to weigh this project against other projects.
And when the administration initially floated this to us in our retreat, way back in January or just whatever it was, they felt like maybe we could do this without a bond, without putting that on the residents. There was maybe some way that we could work it out with the sale of property or development, that type of thing. And certainly if the opportunity came where we weren't going to have to bond for it, we're going to have to put that on to the residents, then it's a win-win. But I guess that's a big question. The financial piece is a big.
It's altogether possible, as Paul has hinted, as Ray has mentioned, that taking the step to develop this particular property would then play into the funding available for capital improvement. That is, there's real expense in staying here in the existing facility, and by being able to move somewhere else, we may very well free funds up that could be applied toward capital improvements.
You get to see those numbers and see how that plays out.
So if we have put out an RFP next 3 to 4 weeks, we would probably give developers a couple of months to put together a proposal. It would not be a really thorough proposal because these are expensive to put together really thorough proposals, but enough to get us to the next step of saying we have a developer who we like, and he seems to have beginnings of a good plan for how to go about doing it. Or if there just isn't anybody that does that, at least we'll make the effort.
You'll be watching longingly from St. Petersburg, right?
Yeah, Provo.org will be. Thank you.
Mr. Beckham, it's an honor to have you with us. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Bonomo, very good to have you here as well. I invite a motion for adjournment. So moved. Thank you, Mr. Winterton. Mr. Garrett, second. All in favor? Vote is unanimous.